Imagine drinking from a stream, filled with sewage, dead animals, and your neighbour's secrets. Welcome to medieval Europe, where every sip was a gamble with death. Think your oat milk latte is a bit off today, poor thing? Try waking up in a medieval village where your morning beverage options were rainwater, with mosquito larvae river broth, with hints of sewage, or if you're feeling fancy, last week's ale that started fermenting again. The 14th century didn't do clean, it barely did alive. If you were thirsty, you weren't just risking indigestion, you were entering a game of microbial Russian roulette, and the revolver had 5 bullets. See, back then, nobody talked about hydration as self-care. Water wasn't something you sipped with cucumber slices. It was a biological dare. Most peasants didn't even trust water, and for good reason, because water back then was less source of life and more vehicle of death. You don't sip from a river when you know your neighbour's cow just died in it. You might assume people would just boil their water right adorable. Boiling required fire, fire required wood required money, or at least trees that hadn't already been burned in a bread oven, a witch trial or a Viking raid 2 decades earlier. Most homes didn't have fireplaces suitable for anything more than lukewarm misery, so instead of boiling water they boiled over with dysentery. The freshwater sources were anything but. Wells were basically vertical graveyards for frogs, rats and local gossip. You'd lower your bucket with a prayer, and haul up a soup of insect-leg slime and the occasional tooth. Streams. Let's talk about streams. Upstream was the village tannery pouring in cow guts. Downstream was you drinking regret. And then there was the moat. Oh yes, the romantic medieval moat. You think it's just for defence and aesthetic Instagram drone shots? Nope. It was a stagnant pool of piss-shit rainwater, rotting garbage, dead animals, and occasionally a dead relative. Nobody voluntarily drank from it, unless, of course, they were desperate or French. In both cases it ended with diarrhea and tears. But hey, what about rainwater? Surely that's safe, right? Rain barrels were popular. Too bad they doubled as mosquito orgies and drowning pits for birds. Also, they were rarely cleaned. Mould colonies developed personalities. Some rain barrels developed ecosystems so complex they deserved names and zip codes. You didn't drink from them, you negotiated with them. Children weren't exempt. In fact, kids were often the designated water fetchers. Picture this, a 10-year-old barefoot child trudging half a mile to a muddy ditch, filling a wooden bucket that weighed more than he did, dodging wild pigs and drunk uncles, and carrying it home without spilling a drop. Modern kids whine about carrying a reusable water bottle. This kid's bottle had worms. Even castles weren't safe. You'd think nobles had crystal clear mountain springs piped in with unicorn magic. Nope. Their water just had slightly less rat in it. Nobles sometimes imported water in barrels like expensive wine. But after a week of transport and no refrigeration, that water tasted like fermented disappointment and fish burps. It's no wonder wine became the drink of choice. It wasn't fancy, it was functional survival. Water was such a death trap that even monasteries got nervous. Monks, the cleanest folks in town, which isn't saying much, often boiled water before drinking it. But if they didn't have firewood, they blessed it instead. That's right. The logic was, if God wanted you to die from water, he probably had a reason. So drink up and start your confessions. Of course people got sick. Constantly. Diarrhea wasn't a condition, it was a lifestyle. There are letters and journals from the time describing loose bowels as casually as we describe the weather. You'd wake up, poop yourself into a mild coma and then go work the fields. Romantic, right? And let's not forget the plague, one major factor in how quickly the Black Death spread water. People washed themselves, their clothes and their meat in the same water, if they washed at all. Fleas may have ridden on rats, but rats bathed in the same river you did. That's the circle of death Disney didn't tell you about. Now imagine being a traveller. You ride into a new village after 3 days on the road. You're thirsty. But you don't know which well is cursed, which river has a dead ox floating in it, or which innkeeper thinks clean water means filtering it through his beard. Do you risk it, or do you just chew on a moist piece of bark and hope for the best? By now you might ask, but didn't they know water could make them sick? Yes and no. They knew that sometimes after drinking water people died, but the concept of bacteria non-existent. Germ theory. A heretical fantasy. Most folks thought dirty water made you sick because it was too cold or had bad spirits. So they heated it, slightly prayed over it, or added herbs and hoped the spirits preferred herbal tea. Funny thing is, beer saved lives. That's not a joke. Mild ale brewed at home or in taverns boiled the water and fermented it just enough to kill most of the nasties. It didn't get you drunk. It just didn't kill you. Children drank it. Grandmas drank it. Priests drank it. If you were sober in the Middle Ages, you were probably dead. You still with me? Good. Because we're just getting started. Water was just the beginning of the medieval hygiene horror show. The kind of nightmare that makes you look at a public restroom today and go, actually, this is luxury. So next time your tap water smells a little off, don't panic. Just remember, at least it doesn't come with frog bones and cholera. Now let's move downstream. And by that I mean literally. So let's say you're a medieval peasant and you wake up thirsty again. You stumble out of your hay pile, stretch your arms and head toward the freshwater source your family's used for generations, the swamp. Not a poetic term, not a metaphor, an actual swamp, full of frogs, mystery smells and water that looks like soup left out since Christmas. You stare into the surface and something stares back, might be a reflection, might be a leech. This isn't a story about roughing it. This is about survival in a world where your best option for hydration looked like soup, smelled like feet, and tasted like betrayal. And you were grateful, because at least the swamp was wet. It was either that or trying to chew morning dew off cabbage leaves, and good luck with that in February. Most villagers didn't have access to clean springs or wells, so the swamp was as good as it got. Which is like saying expired spam is better than nothing. Technically true, still horrifying. Let's break down what lived in the swamp with you. First, the classics: frogs, mosquitoes, dragonflies, and tiny things that shouldn't have legs but do. Then there were the unexpected guests: rotting branches, dead birds, pig skulls, and occasionally an entire human corpse. Yes, really. Corpses in medieval swamps weren't just an accident. They were part of the scenery. Someone died too poor to bury them. Guess what swamp's right there? Nature's coffin. And unlike a church graveyard, no one charged you rent. The swamp was unintentionally the neighbourhood refrigerator. People dumped meat scraps, bones, fish heads, and old stew into it. Not to preserve them, just to throw them out. Except the swamp didn't throw anything away. It kept it. It grew it. The water turned into a thick greenish-grey potion that burbled in the summer sun and froze solid in winter, trapping last season's horrors in a time capsule of filth. It was a medieval snow globe, but instead of glitter, you had dead mice. Swamps weren't just dirty, they were strategic. Villages were often built near them because swamps were hard to invade through soggy, unpredictable terrain, perfect for deterring knights on horses. But the same muck that stopped invaders also stopped your intestines from functioning. Drinking from a swamp meant ingesting centuries of backwash from your entire ancestry. You weren't just swallowing water, you were absorbing community trauma one sip at a time. Of course there were rumours. Don't drink from the north end, it's cursed. Avoid the spot where the goat drowned. That patch foams when it rains, it's got devil's piss in it. No one had science, but everyone had stories. If a family started vomiting uncontrollably, people didn't blame bacteria, they blamed bad swamp spirits, or the weird guy with one eye who lived near the edge. And what was the solution? More swamp water, but with crushed herbs. Congratulations, you just made medieval Gatorade. Swamps were also used for spiritual cleansing. That's not a joke. Some sects believed in ritual immersion even in stagnant water. Monks would dunk themselves in mud-ridden pools to cleanse the soul, then go back to copying Bibles with pruned fingers and intestinal worms. Talk about multitasking. You were closer to God and closer to dysentery all in one splash. That's efficiency. And speaking of spiritual matters, swamps were where curses were thrown. Witches weren't burned yet. No problem. Just toss their spellbook into the swamp. Got a haunted object into the murk. Think someone hexed your cow. Throw their name on a rock and sink it in the bog. The swamp wasn't just a water source. It was the medieval equivalent of the delete key. The only issue the swamp never deleted, it archived. We have archaeological evidence of all this. When modern-day researchers drain bogs and swamps, what do they find? Bones, coins, shoes, entire skeletons still wearing their belts. One bog in Denmark coughed up a guy who died so long ago he predates Christianity, but his hair was still there. Imagine sipping water from that bog while Ragnar the Damp lounges beneath the surface like a forgotten tea bag. Tasty. But let's not pretend peasants had better options. Wells, if your village had one, weren't magical fountains. They were deep holes dug with primitive tools lined with crumbling stones and occasionally used as emergency trash cans, or toilets, or both. When the well dried up in summer, people didn't refill it. They just cried a little blame the devil and went back to the swamp. The devil got blamed for a lot, including plumbing, which is fair. In towns and cities, the swamp's urban cousin was the moat. We talked about it briefly before, but it deserves more shame. The moat was supposed to protect castles. What it really did was ferment. People dumped everything into it, leftovers, sewage, dead animals and criminals' heads. And since it surrounded the castle, guess where the noble's kitchen got its water? You guessed it, right through a filtered channel from the moat. That's right, royal soup. Now imagine being a noble and sipping a silver goblet of wine which had been diluted with clean water, unaware that it had just passed a bloated duck corpse and a severed hand. But don't worry, the wine was blessed. The medieval motto, if it smells like Satan, just pray harder. You can almost hear the bacteria cackling. Animals weren't kept away from water sources either. Pigs bathed in them. Horses peed in them. Chickens drowned in them. Dogs fell in and forgot how to get out. Then villagers fished them out, washed the body in the same water, and continued using it for stew. And you thought your roommate double-dipping in hummus was gross. Here's something darker. During times of famine or disease, people would deliberately throw dead bodies into water sources to spread the suffering to rival villages. Early biological warfare. The thinking went, if we're dying, they should too. A noble idea executed with plague-ridden precision. Swamps and streams became battlegrounds, not with swords, but with vomit bacteria and spite. Children drowned often. Nobody knew how to swim, and even if they did, swamps weren't swimmable. They were thick, mucky, uneven nightmares. A single misstep and gloop gone. The water sucked you under like a vengeful pudding. Parents would warn kids, don't go near the edge or the swamp will eat you. That wasn't a metaphor, that was Tuesday. There are entire folk songs about people losing things in swamps. Ring shoes lovers. Swamps were emotional vacuums. You cried by the swamp. You made offerings to the swamp. And eventually the swamp took something important. Your health, your hope, or your last functional kidney. If you lived long enough, you learned to fear still water. You became a connoisseur of foam thickness, leach density, and frog-to-water ratios. You could tell if a puddle was fresh or possessed by the way it burbled when you tossed a stick in. Rainwater off the roof was gourmet. Swamp water was punishment. But you drank it anyway because the human body can only go so long without fluids, and the medieval world wasn't offering sparkling options. So here's the final insult. While peasants were choking on swamp sludge, nobles were importing water in barrels from miles away only for it to rot during transport. The rich paid for bad water in style. The poor got theirs free with bonus insects. Everyone suffered equally, just in different fonts. And yet, they survived. Sort of. Enough of them lived to make more people who made more people who eventually made you sitting here with a triple filtered hydration bottle and a luxury anxiety disorder. You should probably thank them. Not for their hygiene, but for their sheer refusal to die despite chugging frog-flavoured soup for centuries. Now that we've had a proper sip of swamp sorrow, it's time to move on. Because medieval people didn't just drink water. Oh no! Sometimes they worshipped it. Sometimes they bathed in it. And sometimes they blessed it before it killed them. Let's say the swamp soup didn't kill you. Congratulations, you're now ready for the medieval upgrade holy water. No, not the kind that burns vampires. We're talking about that blessed by Brother Gerard in the name of St. Cuffalo water, sitting in a dusty stone basin at your local church, gently bubbling with sin backwash and the occasional pigeon feather. It was considered sacred. It was also, let's be honest, a bacterial rave with a choir soundtrack. People drank it, rubbed it on wounds, baptized babies in it. In theory, holy water was supposed to purify the soul. In practice, it turned your soul into a leaky sponge and gave you pink eye. The logic was flawless. If a monk said a Latin phrase over a bowl of possibly frog-adjacent liquid, it could now heal your scabies and ward off plague. You know, instead of causing it. Holy water, the medieval version of essential oils, but wetter and less regulated. Monasteries, churches and shrines were often the only places people trusted water, from which tells you a lot about how desperate they were. Pilgrims would travel hundreds of miles just to kneel beside a miracle spring and lap it up like dogs at a wine tasting. These miracle springs were usually just regular springs that hadn't been peed in recently, yet somehow people believed they cured blindness, gout, leprosy and heartbreak. One guy allegedly bathed his foot in a holy puddle and claimed his corn disappeared. Science. No, but his corn did smell better afterward. If you think today's bottled water industry thrives on hype, medieval miracle water was the original scam. Vendors bottled it in clay flasks and sold it to believers like it was magic potion. This one's from the well since somebody sneezed into. This one was blessed on a Tuesday stronger than Wednesday water. Pilgrims didn't care. They guzzled it, smeared it, gave it to sick goats. The belief was if it's been touched by the divine, it can't hurt you. Spoiler alert, it could hurt you. A lot. One popular belief was that water which passed through a saint's bones, yes. Actual bones gained mystical powers. That's right. They built fountains over tombs and ran water through relics. You'd queue up with your wooden mug, fill it from a spout that had dribbled past a decayed femur, and sip it with tears of joy and cholera. This wasn't fringe. This was organised religion meets medieval plumbing. Imagine running your tap through a mummified thumb and calling it a health tonic. The holiest of holy water was guarded fiercely. Monks stored it in special barrels marked with crosses and prayers. But storage didn't mean sterile. If a rat got in, God willed it. If it turned green, a sign from heaven. If someone died after drinking it, they were impure. Holy water didn't need testing. It had faith. And faith, as everyone knew, was stronger than bacteria. Except bacteria had better multiplication rates and didn't take Sundays off. Let's not forget the holy fountains that served entire towns. These weren't fountains in the modern sense, no marble cherubs spitting into crystal basins. These were stone mouths trickling into mossy troughs, often shared by humans, livestock and street performers with questionable hygiene. Everyone dipped their hands, some dipped their heads, some baptized chickens for good luck. If you went on a pilgrimage and didn't lick at least 2 sacred fountains, did you even believe? During the Black Death, things got weird. People thought holy water could repel the plague, so they drank more of it. Was it boiled? No. Was it filtered? Please. This was faith-based hydration. Some priests upped the dosage, blessing entire barrels and handing them out to the public like salvation in liquid form. Except they didn't understand germ theory, so they blessed plague-ridden buckets and unknowingly created divine death smoothies. Monks also practiced blessing from a distance to avoid infection. They'd raise their hand toward the crowd and yell Latin over vats of water without touching them. It was the medieval version of a drive-through vaccine, if the vaccine was unboiled communal water and the nurse was chanting in Gregorian. People believed it worked. People died believing it worked. That's devotion for you. If you think holy water was only for the poor and gullible, think again. Nobles had their own rituals. Some demanded that their wine be mixed with holy water to sanctify the spirit. That's right. They watered down wine with God. There are letters from noble women requesting that their babies be washed in the pure tears of St. Lucia. Too bad Lucia had been dead for 500 years, and the tears were probably just mildew from a damp reliquary. Sometimes blessing meant more than just a chant. It involved dipping a relic into the water and letting it marinate like a divine tea bag. What kind of relic? Oh, fingernails, bone fragments, cloth scraps, a chunk of tongue, even hair from saints' heads. Nothing like sipping from a cup of 13th century scalp water to feel spiritually renewed. Tastes like salvation. Smells like decay. What made it worse was the storage. Clay jugs were porous and held onto flavours. If someone used the jug for fermented fish brine last week and now it's full of holy water, well, congratulations, you've created a sacred seafood cocktail. No one washed these containers properly. Water was scarce. So instead of cleaning the jugs, they just poured more faith on top. That's how you end up with 3 generations of bacteria enjoying a church-sponsored rave in your cup. And then there were the healing rituals. Got a rash, rub it with holy water. Fever, drink it. Open wound, pour some on. If that fails, mix it with dirt from a saint's grave and apply it like medieval neosporin. Some even added spider webs and candle wax because nothing says medicine like a haunted craft project. People believed the water absorbed divine energy. In reality, it absorbed spores, dust goat hair, and disappointment. To be fair, not all holy water was lethal. Occasionally it was collected from natural springs that were by coincidence not completely contaminated. But because medieval folks didn't know which spring was safe, they treated them all the same. Safe spring blessed, toxic cesspool also blessed. Who needs evidence when you've got Latin and incense? And let's talk about the pilgrims. Imagine thousands of tired, coughing, unwashed people, all crowding around the same stone basin, taking turns cupping water in filthy hands, snotting into it, then moving on to the next station. Hygiene wasn't even an afterthought. It was considered suspicious. Why are you clean? What are you hiding? One German bishop even banned excessive hand-washing during Lent because it was a form of vanity. This was not a culture that prioritized Purell. Even the concept of blessed rivers got a turn. In some regions, entire rivers were declared holy during feast days. People would wade in, wash sins off, throw coins, and maybe baptize a goat or two. The next day, people downstream got blessed diarrhea. No one made the connection. Sin, not sanitation, was the enemy. Let's not forget that holy water wasn't just a medieval Christian thing. Across the continent, sacred wells and springs existed from pagan times, often rebranded by churches as Christian miracles. Same water, same risk, different deity. Just like rebranding expired yogurt with a new label. This isn't dangerous, it's divine. The bacteria didn't care about the branding. In the end, holy water represented hope. Desperate, slimy, misguided hope. It was a way for people to feel like they had control in a world full of disease, death, and mysterious puddles. It gave them ritual stories and something to drink when swamp soup lost its charm. But let's be clear, the water didn't care about your faith. It didn't care if you prayed. It just wanted to fester, and it did. So next time someone offers you blessed water, maybe ask when it was last filtered. Or maybe just smile, nod, and pour it discreetly onto a plant. You can pray for your sins another way, preferably without botulism. Now that we've blessed our immune system into oblivion, it's time to meet the one beverage that actually saved medieval lives, by accident. Let's be honest, if your water's trying to kill you, you start to look at other options. Tea wasn't a thing yet. Coffee was still lurking in Ethiopia, waiting to destroy sleep forever. Juice. Ha! Unless you count squashed berries fermenting in goatskin, juice was a pipe dream. So what did medieval folks do? They did what any rational, terrified of dysentery population would do. They invented breakfast beer. And no, this isn't some cheeky craft IPA with a pun name like Ye Old Gutbuster. This was small beer, also called table beer, child beer, or thank God this won't kill me beer. It was low in alcohol, mildly fizzy, and safer than literally anything else you could put in your mouth. Including food, including thoughts. Because unlike water beer had to be boiled during brewing, boiling killed stuff. Beer was the accidental invention of civilization's survival instinct. Imagine waking up in a tiny wooden house next to 6 siblings and 1 confused goat. You rub your eyes, cough up some medieval phlegm, and reach for your clay mug of beer. Not because it's fun, not because you're celebrating, but because it's the only fluid that won't give you explosive regret. Beer wasn't a party, it was plumbing insurance. Children drank it. Pregnant women drank it. Monks beggars, nuns plague doctors. You name it, they were sipping on safety. There's this myth that medieval people were drunk all the time. They weren't. Not from beer anyway. Small beer had about 0.5% to 2% alcohol, which means you'd have to drink a barrel to feel tipsy. And by that point, your bladder would have resigned in protest. The goal wasn't intoxication. The goal was survival. A drunk peasant couldn't plough a field. A dead peasant definitely couldn't. So small beer was the Goldilocks zone, just enough alcohol to purify the water, not enough to make you try and wrestle a goose. Brewing beer was like cooking life-saving soup. You started with grain, usually barley, wheat or oats. Add water, mash it into porridge, boil it, strain it, ferment it with yeast. You didn't understand but respected deeply, and voila, survival juice. Flavour, questionable. Texture, slightly bread adjacent. But it didn't kill you, and that's all that mattered. Some towns even made it law that every household had to brew their own because it was safer than trusting the local well, which may or may not have hosted a decomposing duck last Tuesday. Let's talk ingredients. Hops weren't always part of the equation. Early beer was flavoured with herbs, roots, or sometimes just hope. Yarrow heather, mugwort, whatever, looked vaguely green and didn't scream when boiled. These were called Groot beers. They were mildly antiseptic, vaguely spicy, and came in exciting shades of brown. Hops only became widespread in the later medieval period when people realised it helped preserve the beer. Until then, if your brew went bad, you didn't call it spoiled, you called it extra medieval. Now remember, medieval people weren't scientists. They didn't understand why beer was safe. They just knew water, death beer, not death. So they leaned into it. Entire convents were funded by brewing operations. Monks had secret beer recipes more closely guarded than relics. Nuns brewed ale so good even the devil got curious. Some abbeys became beer empires. You think IPAs are intense? Try drinking an abbey beer brewed by a nun who hasn't spoken to anyone in 3 years. Even kids at school got beer breaks. Forget juice boxes, students in monasteries and grammar schools had beer poured into their wooden cups. It was considered nutritious, and in a way it was. Grains, calories, liquid, technically breakfast. You couldn't survive on it alone, but you'd get pretty far before scurvy tapped you on the shoulder. It was like cereal milk, but with yeast and mild hallucinations. Beer also became a form of currency. Workers were often paid partly in ale, especially during harvest season. It boosted morale, and more importantly, didn't kill the workforce. Contracts would state exact daily rations, a pint in the morning, another at lunch, maybe a jug at dinner, if you survived both. People talked about beer the way we talk about coffee. Don't talk to me until I've had my brew, said every haystack-wielding farmer in 1327. Let's not ignore the artistry. Women for a long time were the primary brewers called alewives. They brewed at home and sold the extra. You could spot their houses by the broomstick over the door, which meant beer was ready. Yes, the broomstick was a marketing symbol. No, they weren't witches. Well, until the church got grumpy and decided women who sold too much delicious, successful beer were clearly in league with Satan, which is classic. Some of these alewives became local legends. They developed their own recipes, styles and techniques. They were chemists without the ego entrepreneurs without LinkedIn. And because beer didn't travel well, every village had its own flavour. Your neighbour's beer might be light and sour. The innkeeper's was thick and chewy like emotional porridge. There were no standards, just guesses. And if someone died after drinking a bad batch, you blame the yeast. Or the moon. Of course, beer wasn't perfect. Bad batches happened. Infections ruined whole barrels. Wooden casks weren't exactly sterile. And yeast sometimes went rogue. You'd pour a mug smell sulphur and have to make a decision, drink this and risk violent regret. Or go back to the swamp. Many chose beer anyway. At least the regret was bubbly. Festivals were where beer truly shined. While holy water was being sprinkled and relics paraded through the streets, the real miracle was the beer tent. Picture villagers dancing badly, spilling foam, singing in Latin they didn't understand and blessing each other with burps. Beer turned suffering into spectacle, pain into poker, and the plague into a party until the body started piling again. Beer also had religious significance, not in scripture but in survival. Some monks believed brewing was holy work, transforming grain into life-saving drink. Others believed beer was a gift from God to make suffering tolerable. Considering the average life expectancy and the number of diseases with names like Red Death, it's hard to argue. If God wasn't in the beer, he was at least nearby, sipping silently and nodding. Let's not forget beer as medicine. Medieval doctors would prescribe ale for fever, constipation, depression, and even heartbreak. Feeling melancholic? Try dark ale with extra sage. Got a fever. Light beer with rosemary and a slap across the face. Modern medicine laughs at this. But then again, modern medicine wasn't around to deal with whatever was crawling out of the communal river that week. Beer became a social glue. Villages didn't just drink it, they bonded over it. Disputes were settled over mugs. Marriages negotiated over barrels. Entire taxes were paid in beer. You didn't just have beer, you were beer. It was in your culture, your bloodstream, your breakfast. The foamy thread that held medieval society together. Over time, beer evolved. Hops entered, the picture recipes improved, and eventually sanitation made water drinkable again. But beer never left. It had earned its place. It was no longer just survival, it was tradition. And while we now sip our IPAs in climate-controlled bars with ironic facial hair somewhere deep in our DNA, a tiny medieval peasant voice whispers, "At least this won't kill me." So the next time someone tells you beer is unhealthy, remind them it saved Europe. It was the original water filter, the bubbling line between life and intestinal warfare. The slightly fizzy middle finger to medieval biology. Raise your glass. You're not just drinking beer, you're drinking 800 years of survival instinct. Chug wisely. Because coming up next, we go from what they drank to what they didn't wash. And it only gets worse from here. Let's say you've survived swamp water, miracle soup and beer brewed in clay pots by a nun with a twitchy eye. You're feeling lucky, alive, maybe even dirty. You know the way one might feel after 6 months of sleeping in hay and wearing a single tunic that's absorbed more sweat than a Roman bathhouse. Naturally you'd think, hey, maybe I should bathe. In the medieval world, that idea was about as suspicious as juggling in church. Because here's the thing, in many parts of the Middle Ages, bathing made people uncomfortable. Not in the I hate showering at the gym way, more in the if you bathe too much you're probably a witch, a prostitute or French way. The logic was astonishing. If you cared that much about being clean, you clearly had something to hide. Holiness was about spiritual purity, not armpits. And if your body smelled like a bog demon, that just proved you were focusing on the soul. Public bathhouses did exist, especially in early medieval towns. In fact, they were popular. So popular they became the medieval version of Tinder karaoke bars and steamy gossip cafes all rolled into one. You'd go in to rinse off, come out with a marriage proposal, a business deal or syphilis. Men and women sometimes bathed together, naked, talking, scrubbing, flirting. It was equal parts hygiene and civic engagement. The church did not approve. Eventually, bathhouses were accused of being morally corrupt, disease-ridden, and full of heretics with loofahs. By the 14th century, many cities started banning or restricting public baths altogether, right around the time the Black Death showed up. Not a coincidence. Bathhouses were seen as infection hubs, because obviously if you're clean you must be diseased. The church doubled down, sin lives in the flesh. So if you enjoy soaking your body in warm water, you might as well be rubbing elbows with Satan. But wait, it gets better. There was also a belief that hot water opened your pores, allowing sickness to slip inside. That's right. Hygiene didn't just seem suspicious, it was considered medically dangerous. Cold water was safer, but only if you screamed the whole time. Doctors advised against overwashing, and if you had to bathe, you were told to cover your ears with wax plugs and recite a prayer. Nothing says refreshing like fear-based scrubbing and muffled Latin. Still, peasants had their own routine. It was called don't bathe. Or if you must do it once per season, ideally in a rainstorm when no one's watching. The medieval countryside didn't have private bathrooms, or soap, or shame apparently. Rivers were used for everything: bathing, watering livestock, washing clothes, dumping waste, and possibly fishing out grandma. If you were lucky, you found a spot upstream. If not, you just hoped the flow rate diluted your neighbour's sins. But don't think nobles were squeaky clean either. Kings and queens rarely bathed. Queen Isabella of Castile famously claimed she only bathed twice in her life, once when she was born, once when she got married. Not metaphorically, literally. Her gown probably had more bacteria than a petri dish. Royals used perfume-powdered wigs and scented gloves to cover the stench. They didn't clean their bodies, they layered over the decay like lasagna. Perfume wasn't a luxury, it was survival. Nobles carried scented handkerchiefs to hold over their noses when commoners walked by, or when their own reflection tried to warn them about the smell. Even medical treatments involved aromatic herbs stuffed in pockets and robes to ward off disease. Basically, if you walked into a noble court and smelled lavender, it wasn't style, it was desperation. Let's talk about soap. It existed, but using it was controversial. Most common soap was made from animal fat and lye, and it had the consistency of regret. Nobles imported fancier soap with olive oil and exotic spices, which was about as effective as rubbing scented butter on a corpse. Soap didn't foam the way we're used to, it just smeared. And since people thought washing too often was unhealthy, the soap often went unused, unless you were washing your clothes once a month in a cold stream full of eels. And speaking of clothes, this was another genius strategy. People didn't wash themselves, they washed their linen underclothes. The idea was that linen absorbed the bad stuff, and if you swapped your shirt once every few weeks, you were practically a doctor. Medieval people actually believed that changing your shirt had the same effect as bathing. Spoiler, it didn't. But it was socially acceptable. Bathing was weird. Shirt changing heroic. Now when someone did decide to bathe, say a noble who wanted to impress a visiting diplomat, they'd go all out. Hot water was carried in buckets, herbs were steeped like tea, and assistants stood by, with towels made from imported unicorn wool, probably just goat. The bather would sit in a wooden tub topless or fully nude, surrounded by courtiers pretending not to inhale. There were candles, there was music, there was a priest outside the room in case they died from cleanliness shock. The paranoia got so deep that some towns passed laws restricting bathhouse activity during plague outbreaks. You could be fined or arrested for scrubbing too thoroughly. Bathhouse owners were accused of inviting death into the city, and yet they stayed open in secret. Because even in a medieval panic, people still didn't want to smell like fermented sadness. Underground bathhouses became a thing, like speakeasies, for armpits. Even medical advice reflected this madness. Doctors recommended dry washing, which meant rubbing yourself with a cloth and pretending that did something. Some even used flour or powdered chalk to soak up impurity. Others believed that sweat was healthy and should be encouraged. So people wore heavy layers year-round to build up a fine, glistening crust of good humours. This wasn't hygiene, it was self-marination. Monks, ironically, were among the cleanest. Monastic orders required regular washing of hands and faces. Some even had bathing schedules. But they were seen as too clean, like maybe they were trying to cover up sin with soap. Suspicion followed them. "What's Brother Thomas hiding under those robes? Oh, just ankles, washed ankles. Scandalous." Women had it worse, of course. If a woman bathed too much, she was vain. If she didn't bathe, she was disgusting. If she opened a bathhouse, she was a whore. If she tried to invent deodorant, she was a heretic. The options were stink or get burned. And yet many did bathe secretly, carefully, using rosewater or mint leaves in stolen buckets of warm rain. It wasn't just hygiene, it was rebellion. There were even political implications to bathing. Kings used baths to show off. Royal bathhouses were decorated with murals, fountains, and servants whose entire job was towel arrangement. When a monarch bathed, it became a public affair. Courtiers watched. Poets wrote verses. Ambassadors were invited. Today His Majesty removed 6 months of royal filth. All hail. And yet 2 days later he'd be back to smelling like a smoked ham in a shoe. Eventually cities built aqueducts and bathhouses modelled after Roman designs. But the momentum didn't last. The association between water sin and disease stayed strong for centuries. By the time people wanted to bathe again, the infrastructure had rotted and the doctors had given up. Just wear lavender and try not to breathe through your mouth. Today we have showers with temperature control soap with pH balanced shampoo that smells like rain on a meadow. We stand under streams of clean warm water and call it me time. But for most of medieval history, water wasn't me time, it was potential homicide. If someone asked when your last bath was, you didn't answer. You just blinked and hoped they didn't report you to the bishop. So next time you're standing in a hot shower complaining that the pressure isn't quite right, remember, there was once a man who was arrested for scrubbing his knees, and someone else died never knowing the smell of soap. Perspective is a powerful scent. And now prepare your stomach because we're about to follow the water down. If you thought rivers were safe, think again. In medieval times, a river wasn't a peaceful blue ribbon winding through the countryside. It was a giant open sewer with scenic views. Sure, it sparkled in the sun, but that sparkle probably sunlight bouncing off floating lard, or a decomposing cow, or a knight's dented chamber pot swirling merrily downstream. Rivers were less natural beauty and more liquid accusation. People used rivers for everything: drinking, washing, disposing, defecating, baptizing, and occasionally drowning things they didn't want to deal with, like chickens, curses, or cousins. And they didn't assign different spots for each purpose. It was all one big medieval smoothie. Upstream, someone was dumping blood from the slaughterhouse. Midstream, a washerwoman scrubbed a tunic so crusted it stood up by itself. Downstream, that's where you dipped your mug and whispered, "Please don't kill me." In towns, it got worse. Rivers running through cities were loaded with filth. Butchers tossed animal guts straight in. Tanneries, which used urine and lime to soften hides, emptied their mix into the flow. Bakers dumped their ash. Fullers released chemical sludge. It wasn't water, it was liquid resume of industrial sins. And somehow people still thought, well, it's moving, so it must be clean. Speed doesn't equal purity. Ask any fast-moving rat. Let's talk about the dyeing industry, not the emotional kind. Cloth dyers used rivers to rinse fabrics soaked in harsh, colourful chemicals, often urine-based. Imagine that. You're trying to make a crimson tunic, and you use fermented pea and alum. Then rinse it in the town river where your neighbours also get their water. The final product looked fabulous. The water looked like clown vomit. But hey, at least it was authentic. You might ask, why not build a sewage system? Excellent question. The Romans had one. Medieval Europe said, nah, let's just wait until it rains. Their plan was dump it, forget it, and pray the river didn't get offended. London, for example, had the Thames, a mighty river, turned into a toilet bowl with ambition. People tossed entire chamber pots out of windows, letting their contents hit the street, and eventually make their way into the river, sometimes aided by gravity, sometimes by servants with brooms. And what did they do with this river? They drank it. Not all the time, but enough. Wells were scarce, rain barrels unreliable. So when the river didn't smell too murderous, they'd scoop up a bit, and hope the Lord was feeling merciful that day. There are records of people fishing in rivers next to tannery drains, fish with 6 eyes and the taste of leather. Bon appétit. Bathing in rivers was common too. On hot days, people stripped and jumped in, women, men, children, the occasional priest who just needed to clear his thoughts. But of course, they weren't alone. The river had company: dead pigs, soggy shoes, unexplained hair clumps, and at least one dog that refused to leave. Bathing in the river was like scrubbing yourself with liquid secrets. You left with slightly cleaner skin and at least 3 new diseases. Now, if you think this was only a peasant problem, think again. Nobles built castles near rivers for defence and water access. But their toilets, the glorified holes in stone walls known as garderobes, emptied directly into the moat or nearby stream. So while they sat on their stone thrones reading poetry and feeling smug, they were unknowingly contributing to the exact problem they were bathing in. That's called full circle karma. Some cities tried to regulate it. They passed laws: don't dump animal heads in the river on Sundays, no throwing rotten bread after dusk, don't wash your sheep downstream from the bishop's wine barge. But good luck enforcing those. The rivers became democratic dump zones. Everyone shared. Everyone suffered. It was the closest thing to medieval socialism. River-based disease outbreaks were common. Dysentery, of course. Typhoid naturally. A little salmonella to spice things up. Why not? But the people didn't blame the water, they blamed the stars, or the devil, or foreigners, or if all else failed, the moon. The water was just water. It had always been there. Surely something that natural couldn't be the reason everyone's intestines were playing Gregorian chants in minor key. There were myths too. Some believed river spirits lived in the water. If the river was angry, it would poison you. If it was pleased, it would cleanse your soul. Which is medieval, for you won't die today. People left offerings on the banks: bread, flowers, a chicken, occasionally their opes. It was half ritual, half panic. Because when your science is built on hearsay and astrology, every ripple feels like a prophecy. People also believed in healing rivers. Certain springs were said to cure diseases. Why? Because one guy claimed his rash went away after falling in. Never mind that he also lost a toe to frostbite and possibly hallucinated the Virgin Mary mid-dunk. The story spread. Pilgrims came, and the river, now filled with thousands of sweaty believers, became a hotbed of blessings and bacteria. Drink the miracle water, they said. It'll heal you. What it actually did was unite skin diseases across Europe. And then there were the executions. That's right. Some towns threw criminals into rivers as punishment, or to test guilt. If they floated, they were witches. If they sank, they were innocent. Too bad either way, they drowned regardless. Rivers didn't just carry waste, they carried judgment. The water was judge, jury, and funeral director. Let's not forget that rivers were also trade routes. Barges carried grain, beer, wine, textiles, and disease. A rat with fleas could hitch a ride from one town to another in under a day. The river didn't just flow, it connected. It spread everything: goods, news, parasites. It was a medieval Amazon Prime delivery system for bacteria, and still people built near them. They farmed near them. They dreamed of waterfront property, because rivers, despite everything, meant life. Fertile soil, travel, fish debatably edible. The irony, the thing that gave life, also took it. Slowly, steadily, with a moist chuckle. Rivers were beautiful and cruel, like a medieval influencer with bad hygiene and sword. Some towns eventually tried to clean their rivers. They built little channels, diverted waste, even banned dye factories from dumping. Did it work? Kind of, until it rained. Then everything just washed back in laughing. Nature, bless her heart, tried to help rain diluted the filth, but it also moved it. From your village to the next, so if your neighbour got diarrhoea, that was your fault. Medieval friendship river style. And yet, despite all this, people didn't stop using the rivers, because they couldn't. There was no plan B. The rivers weren't trusted, but they were necessary. Like that one friend who always shows up late, ruins the party, and somehow still gets invited to the next one. You needed water, and the river full of secrets and stew was always there. Flowing, judging, occasionally frothing. It's wild to imagine now people kneeling at a murky bank, cupping their hands into a stream that had recently digested a goat, a shoe, and a conspiracy. They drank it, splashed their face, washed, a baby dumped a chamber pot all within 50 feet of each other. And then they wondered why everyone had boils, but they didn't stop. Because rivers were ancient. Rivers were powerful. Rivers were normal. If everyone you know is drinking filth, you don't question it. You just develop a tolerance or die. Medieval life was a constant exercise in manageable horror, and rivers were just part of the scenery. Wet, loud, unpredictable scenery. So next time you see a clean river sparkling through a modern city lined with bike lanes and swans and overpriced brunch spots, remember that river probably has a medieval cousin who once carried plague pickles and a bishop's underpants. Respect it. But maybe don't swim in it just yet. Coming up next, let's talk about how medieval folks tried to take care of their mouths. Spoiler, they mostly didn't. Let's talk teeth, or rather the jagged yellow-grey battlefield hiding inside the average medieval mouth. If you're imagining pearly white, stop. Medieval teeth weren't white straight or remotely cared for. They were functional stumps for chewing salted meat and shouting across mead halls. Tooth care was about as prioritised as space travel technically possible, but no one knew how or cared enough to try. And why would they? Sugar, the number one enemy of modern teeth, wasn't even a thing yet, at least not for peasants. So medieval folks thought, well, I'm not eating candy, I'm fine. Except they were eating coarse bread filled with stone dust dried meat tougher than logic and drinking vinegar ales. Basically, their teeth were under daily assault from chewing gravel and regret, and the concept of floss, please. The only string in their lives was for tying pigs or sins. So what did they use for toothpaste? Glad you asked. The list includes crushed bones, powdered charcoal chalk, ash, burnt rosemary, and yes, actual river slime. Because if it's green, gooey and kind of minty, if you squint someone in the 1300s, rubbed it on their gums and called it wellness. They didn't have Colgate, they had desperation and moss. Chewing sticks were popular. People would strip small branches from hazel birch or mallow trees, fray the ends and rub them against their teeth. Sometimes with ash, sometimes with spit, sometimes with the blessing of St. Apollonia, the patron saint of dental agony. Because of course teeth had their own saint. And somewhere in heaven she watched peasants scrub their molars with soot and cried gently into a cup of lye. If you were wealthy, you might have a special tooth powder imported from Venice or Constantinople. Fancy stuff made with burnt eggshells, powdered deer horn and aromatic herbs. It smelled nice. It also stripped enamel like a medieval sandblaster. But hey, at least your breath didn't knock over livestock anymore. Priorities. Speaking of breath, it wasn't great. In fact, medieval halitosis could qualify as a war crime. You know it's bad when someone faints mid-sentence and everyone just assumes it's divine punishment. People chewed parsley or cloves to mask the stench. Monks sometimes sucked on licorice roots between prayers. But let's be honest, no amount of herbs can cancel out decades of decay and shame. Mouthwash. They gargled wine or vinegar, occasionally urine. Not a typo, actual urine. Because it's sterile, they said. Because it's horrifying, we reply. But wait, it gets worse. Dental surgery existed. Kind of. Medieval dentists weren't licensed professionals. They were barbers. Yes, the guy trimming your bangs also yanked teeth with rusty pliers and a prayer. No anaesthetic, no sterilisation, just a strong grip and someone holding you down, while a lute player tried to drown out your screams with aggressively cheerful music. Imagine losing a molar and your dignity at the same time. Tooth removal was the go-to solution for everything. Pain, yank it. Rot, yank it. Mild discomfort. Say no more, yank it. Preventative care wasn't even a theory. People thought toothaches came from toothworms, tiny demons that burrowed into your molars and whispered pain. To get rid of them, healers burned herbs near your face, hoping the worm would evacuate like a medieval eviction notice. Unsurprisingly, the pain usually stayed. If your teeth fell out naturally, that was considered lucky. It meant you'd lived long enough for your teeth to give up. Toothless elders were a common sight, gumming bread soaked in ale, smiling like victorious war veterans. No dentures, no implants, just soft foods and lowered expectations. If you wanted a new tooth, maybe carve one from wood or shell, and then glue it in with beeswax. Bonus, you now whistle when you talk. There were love poems about teeth. Seriously. Troubadours wrote verses praising a lady's ivory smile and glimmering pearls. We don't know what kind of lighting they had, but it must have been dim, because the average medieval smile looks more like a weathered fence than anything poetic. Still, romance finds a way, especially when no one's brushed in a month and you're comparing breath levels instead of teeth. Dental hygiene rituals varied by region. In some parts of Europe, people brushed once a week if they remembered. In others, they'd only do it before big events, like weddings or executions. Because if you're going to meet God or your in-laws, you might as well scrape the barnacles off your molars. Just don't smile too wide, or someone might think you're possessed. Animals got better care sometimes. Horses had their teeth filed. Dogs were fed herbs for breath. Pigs didn't care. But humans, you were on your own. Occasionally travelling tooth pullers would come to town with their tools and loud coats. They set up in the square like carnival barkers. Step right up, one tug and the pain is gone, or your money back. Spoiler, there were no refunds. Only blood. Some monks kept records of dental remedies. Apply warm vinegar to the cheek. Gargle honey mixed with salt. Place a clove between the gums and pray for strength. These weren't treatments, they were polite ways of saying you're about to suffer. Herbalists tried everything: sage, mint, wormwood, burnt onion skins. Nothing worked. And yet people kept trying. Because medieval pain tolerance was legendary. Or because they'd already survived swamp water and nothing scared them anymore. Tooth infections. Oh yes, they were called jaw rot or face plague. Gums swelled, abscesses formed, and pus flowed like tragic poetry. Sometimes the infection spread to the brain. People became feverish, delirious, convinced they'd been cursed. And technically they had. Cursed by bacteria and bad decisions. The cure, lancing the abscess with a hot knife, or dying quietly behind the stables. If a noble lost a tooth, it became a political event. His Majesty's right incisor has fallen, prepare the mourners, courtiers whispered. Diplomats speculated. Poets tried to make it sound noble. He lost it in battle, they'd say, bit too hard into a diplomatic pastry. And then the king would wear a jewelled mask to hide his toothless shame, while secretly eating everything through a straw. And then there were the fakes. False teeth made from animal bone ivory or even other people's teeth. Grave robbing was a legitimate profession. Dig up corpses, extract usable teeth, sell them to dentists. Premium post-mortem molars. Only slightly haunted. Some rich folks had entire sets of these grim souvenirs, giving new meaning to the term deadpan smile. Despite the horror, there were bright spots. Some people had surprisingly healthy teeth. Rural diets with less sugar, more fibre and fewer processed foods meant less decay. Archaeologists have found medieval skulls with intact molars and minimal cavities. But these were exceptions. Most mouths were war zones. And when they finally fell silent, they left behind grim smiles frozen in bone. Medieval art almost never shows teeth. Think about that. Thousands of portraits, saints, sinners, kings, beggars, and not a single one is beaming. Not because they were sad, but because showing teeth was unwise, unflattering, unholy, also dangerous. Smiling widely in public could get you accused of madness or seduction or dental fraud. So how did people flirt carefully? With eyes, with song, with gifts of rosemary or garlic to mask their scent. Kisses were brief, mouths were private territory. Lovers whispered sweet nothings without exhaling too hard. It was romantic. It was tragic. It was mostly survival instinct. And yet somehow they got through it. Teeth rotted, mouths ached, breath scorched, but life continued. People loved married, prayed, ate, sang, with crooked teeth and bloodied gums, with pain that never left and smiles they dared not share. Because in the grand scheme of medieval suffering, dental care was just another beast in the forest. So next time you brush your teeth with an electric toothbrush and fluoride paste, remember someone once tried to scrape their tongue clean with a stick and a dead squirrel's tail. Be grateful, spit twice, and never take mint for granted. Coming up next, we stop talking about mouths and go back to power. Water wasn't just dirty, it was political. Water wasn't just wet in the Middle Ages, it was power. Literal life juice that dictated who lived comfortably and who licked moss behind the chicken pen. Forget gold, forget titles. If you controlled a clean spring, you were a god. A muddy, lice-ridden, painfully thirsty god. Peasants could toil all they wanted, but if the lord upstream shut off access to water, they were done. Not metaphorically. Done. Control over water was a feudal flex. Castles were built near rivers, springs and wells for strategic reasons, which is code for monopoly on not dying. A noble with a private well had leverage over hundreds of people who didn't. Want to water your crops? Pay a tax. Want to fill a bucket for your baby? Swear loyalty, offer eggs, or give your daughter in marriage to the lord's sweaty nephew. Medieval diplomacy often started with a bucket and ended with generational trauma. Wells became battlegrounds, not loud battles, mind you. Quiet, bitter generational squabbles with poison bribes and passive-aggressive praying. There were cases of villagers sabotaging neighbouring wells by throwing in dead animals, feces or cursed objects like shoes with nails in them. Nothing says stay out like a goat's skull bobbing at the surface of your morning drink. Some wells were so regularly sabotaged towns built wooden lids and padlocks. Imagine having to unlock your own water with a key while glancing over your shoulder like a paranoid goblin. Monasteries had their own water wars. Monks were surprisingly territorial about their springs. They diverted entire streams into their abbeys, blocking off peasants downstream with all the subtlety of a dam made of spite. They called it God's will. The peasants called it Tuesday. And when confronted, the monks would shrug and recite Latin until everyone got tired and went home to drink mud. Water taxes were a thing. You could be taxed for collecting rainwater, for pulling water from the town fountain, even for owning a bucket big enough to cause envy. In some places, water was measured out by the jug, and guards monitored how much each family took. If you were caught overfilling, they didn't fine you, they humiliated you. One man in France was forced to walk naked through town carrying 2 overflowing pails while the local priest threw breadcrumbs at him. Justice was theatrical. Then there were water rights. Entire legal systems grew around who could access which stream when and how much. Think you can just take a quick dip in the river, not unless you were born on the right side of it. People were literally born into different levels of hydration. If your land deed included stream access, you were basically royalty. If it didn't, you'd be lucky to bathe once before your wedding, or funeral, whichever came first. Urban water politics were nastier. In cities, fountains were installed with great pride and great inequality. Wealthy districts got ornate stone fountains with lion heads and tiled basins. Poorer neighbourhoods, maybe a trough if they were lucky, or a pipe that dribbled water between 4 a.m. and 4:12 a.m. Lines formed before sunrise. Fights broke out. Fist fights. Bucket fights. Even documented cases of full-scale brawls using wooden spoons and raw turnips. All over half a litre of semi-drinkable sludge. Water theft was a punishable crime. People would sneak into noble estates at night to fill jugs from private wells. One woman was caught stealing 2 buckets of Duke's water and sentenced to a week in stocks with a placard that read, "I took what wasn't mine and now I'm dry." That's medieval branding. Another man tried to dig his own secret well on land that didn't belong to him and was arrested for unauthorised hydration. That's right. He went to jail for being thirsty in the wrong direction. Control of water wasn't just local, it shaped entire wars. Villages upstream had enormous power over those below. Divert a river, and you could destroy an entire agricultural economy without lifting a sword. Want to break a siege, poison the well. Want to weaken your enemy's morale, block the aqueduct. Armies didn't march on empty stomachs, but they also didn't march without hydration. More than one noble won a war simply by owning a pond and a bad attitude. Women often bore the brunt of water politics. They were the ones fetching water, waiting in line, carrying it back and getting blamed when it ran out. If a well dried up people, blamed witches. If the water made people sick, they blamed women for drawing it wrong. There were literal accusations of cursed buckets. And yes, some women were executed because the village cow got diarrhea after drinking water they collected. That's not a joke. That's historical misogyny with a ladle. Even within households, water was hierarchical. Fathers drank first, then sons, then guests, then the mother, then the other children, and finally, if anything was left, maybe the dog. If you were the last one in line, you weren't drinking water. You were drinking everyone else's backwash sins and probably a toe, which might explain why the family pet often looked healthier than the youngest child. When towns did try to build shared water infrastructure, pumps, canals or reservoirs, they quickly became symbols of status. The location of your home in relation to the water determined your social standing. Upstream, you were someone. Downstream, you were someone's problem. And of course, corruption crept in. Local officials rerouted pipes to their own homes. Priests claimed holy springs for exclusive spiritual use. Merchants installed fake wells to charge the desperate, because capitalism always finds a puddle. Royalty had it best. Kings had entire staffs just for water. Well-keepers, cupbearers, taster slaves. That's right, taster slaves. People whose job it was to sip the royal water first in case it was poisoned. They didn't last long, but the king. He stayed hydrated, perfumed, and clueless. Meanwhile, peasants were boiling cabbage 3 times in the same pot, just to extract enough liquid to stay vertical. Let's not forget religious influence. Water wasn't just political, it was spiritual property. The church decided which springs were holy and which were not. Want access to a miracle fountain? Pay your tithe. Kiss a relic. Crawl 3 miles on your knees while reciting psalms. The church had a monopoly on both sin and sanitation, and they played both sides. Come be healed, they cried. And if it didn't work, you must have been really filthy. This control extended to pilgrimages. Entire towns made fortunes from blessed wells and sacred fountains. They sold tiny bottles of holy water for insane prices. Some of it wasn't even real, just repackaged rain or rebranded swamp juice. But people believed, and that belief gave power. If the crowd says it's holy, it doesn't matter if it smells like trout and old socks. In the later Middle Ages, cities started developing aqueducts and cisterns. It helped. A little, but only the wealthy truly benefited. Poorer districts remained water-starved. Some people lived their entire lives with no running water, no access to clean springs, and no hope. They learned to steal, to bribe, to carry jugs for miles, to wait in lines that wrapped around churches. And when all else failed, they went back to the river, or the swamp, or the sky. Rain collection was a last resort. People placed pots on rooftops, barrels in courtyards, and buckets on windowsills. It wasn't much, and in dry seasons it meant fighting over puddles. There are court records of people suing neighbours for stealing the rain that fell on their roof. Let that sink in. People filed lawsuits over droplets. Because when you're that desperate, every drop is a throne. And despite all this struggle, the idea of water as a basic right didn't exist. It was a resource to be fought over, controlled, priced and hoarded. A weapon, a blessing, a curse. Today we argue over bottled brands with hints of glacier or vague whispers of fruit. But back then, people fought over who got to drink and who got to die of dehydration. And the line between the two was often drawn by power, not plumbing. So next time you refill your glass from the tap without thinking, remember someone once got arrested for owning a large bucket. Someone once paid a month's wages for a cup of slightly clear spring water. And someone else died with their face in a puddle because they tried to drink from the wrong well. Coming up next, fire up the cauldron because we're diving into boiling water, or rather the tragic lack of it. Imagine you've realised water is killing you, so you think, let's boil it. Admirable. Problem is, boiling water in the Middle Ages was less science and more sorcery. You needed wood, you needed a pot, you needed fire. And none of those were cheap. Most dwellings had a hearth for cooking and warming, but sustaining a rolling boil for safety required hours of labour and fuel luxuries for peasants, whose day started before dawn and ended after dusk stacking wood for tomorrow's death soup. Fuel was scarce. Trees were being chopped faster than people could replant them. Charcoal burned hotter but cost money peasants didn't have. Bringing wood to the village meant you either cut your own illegal in many forests or bought it from the lord at inflated wartime rates. Also, fire in a wooden house was a gamble. One spark and you'd burn your house and possibly your family down. So many villages banned indoor fires lasting more than an hour at a time. Boiling water, basically arson adjacent. Pots were another hurdle. You couldn't just grab a saucepan. You needed sturdy iron or bronze cookware which only the relatively wealthy possessed. Peasants used clay or wooden bowls, cracked unsealed, full of bacteria, and useless for boiling. Even if you boiled water, it had to stay that way until drinking. Without insulation, it cooled quickly and picked up whatever was backdrafting through village air. And yes, people drank lukewarm toxic sludge because it was the best they could manage. Now consider the logistics. To boil for everyone in a household, you'd need a massive pot or several smaller ones. You'd haul them to the hearth, collect wood, guard the fire, stir the scum, and fend off curious goats. Meanwhile, your neighbours mocked you from across the street. Looky there, Marjorie's trying to cook death out of water again. You boiled, they babbled social pressure, discouraged boiling. Why be the witch when you could just drink the swamp? In towns, you had communal ovens, but only for bread. Villagers could rent time in those ovens, but priorities were loaves, not water. Boiling water after baking meant stealing fire fuel or time, and you risk fines. One city ordinance in Germany forbade using public ovens to boil water, calling it misuse of sacred flames. Even if you had the pot, you had no legal right. So most people just dunked whatever fluid they had into lukewarm stews, hoping the soup god saved them. People also didn't appreciate that you had to bring water to a rolling boil 100°C for at least a minute. They boiled it until it bubbled, then immediately poured it into another container, believing that boiling once is good enough. Except they didn't maintain a hot enough temperature or keep it covered. The hot water cooled tepid in seconds and regained contaminants from air hands or vessels. It was the medieval version of downloading an antivirus update and then unplugging your computer. Even knowledge was limited. Medieval scribes wrote practical manuals, but handed down wisdom relied on rumour and magic. Some believed that adding salt or herbs would help sterilize. Others thought salt made it worse, salt evil. A few tried filtering through cloth or sand primitive filtration that sometimes worked. Sometimes created dust smoothies. No official manual said boil for 5 minutes, let cool store clean. They did the medieval guess and check method, given the stakes that check was often death. But wait, there were exceptions. Apothecaries in town sometimes had specialised boiling vats for medicinal water. They'd sell cures. This will cleanse your gut and your soul. Problem was you had to buy the water expensive and often flavoured with honey, so you couldn't taste the memory of faeces. Wealthy households might employ a retainer called a water bearer, someone who boiled water daily and guarded its purity. But what the poor did was gather rain, pray and whisper, well, it's wet. Even when firewood and pots existed, people feared boiled water tasted flat or metallic. Boiling stripped the character from the water, the flavours they associated with life. A cold swamp bath tasted exciting in comparison, so psychological resistance grew. Cleansing the water felt like giving up a tiny piece of identity in a world where identity was tied to suffering and stew. Church doctrine had a role too. Monastic rules discouraged extended fires or unnecessary comfort. Poverty and humility meant no trendy water sanitation. A monk boiling water for clean drinking could be accused of indulgence. That's right, you could be morally chastised for preventing disease, the badge of survival, suffering. Fire and hygiene were just flashy distractions from spiritual pain. In warfare, armies faced the purity problem head-on. They carried wooden buckets but no fuel, so soldiers drank from local streams' wells whatever looked least foul. Campsites were often marked by the smell of fevers brewing. Surgeons tried boiling water for surgeries, but no way to keep it hot and reuse the same pans for stew. That's why infection rates were 90%. Water boiled. Sure, water sterile. Hardly. Occasionally you'd find villagers boiling beer or wine, not water. Those drinks were social and essential. Everyone watched. But boiling water, lame. Even if it saved lives, boiling water didn't build community. It didn't come with feasts or festivals. It was invisible work. Boiling water got no praise. But cholera got headlines, so people prioritised what got attention. If you could boil water properly, you still needed storage. Casks had to have lids and clean spouts. Barrels leaked. Jars cracked. Wooden storage lost heat. In winter it froze. In summer algae bloomed. Safe water storage demanded design, but designing costs money. Without that infrastructure, boiling was just theatrical. And yet some communities thrived. Alpine villages used hot springs. They built rudimentary pipe systems and relied on geothermal boiling. Those lucky few fared better. But they were exceptions. Most of Europe lived in a loop pollution attempt to boil discouragement, contamination, illness. Rinse, repeat, literally. By the end of the Middle Ages, people began to accept that boiling saved lives. Manuals started to mention it, but too few, and too late. Waterborne diseases still surged. Cholera epidemics in centuries to come proved boiling would have helped, but people often scoffed boiling water. That's for fussy rich folk. So we boil water now without thinking. It's automatic. Part of birthright plumbing. But remember that water is the wrong kind of hot, without centuries of breakthroughs and sacrifices. That bowl of sterile steam in your kitchen, it cost human agony. Every faucet flow is built on medieval failure. Your next drink can be safe because the human race learned to manage WD-40 like fluid properly. Or in medieval terms, to turn death juice into tea. We boiled, we burned, we suffered. Because unlike frogs in a swamp, we said no to being cooked by bacteria. Ever walk through a puddle and worried you'd ruin your shoes? Medieval peasants walked through puddles and worried they'd start a plague. Their water wasn't just dirty, it was aggressively pathogenic. We're not talking about a splash of mud here. We're talking about water that hosted the greatest house party for bacteria in human history, and everyone was invited. It was the Coachella of microscopic death. The bubonic plague didn't politely knock on Europe's door. It kicked it down, waltzed in dripping with pus and lymph, and made itself a permanent guest. While fleas and rats get the star credit, let's not forget their underrated wingman, the water supply. When you bathe once every decade and dump sewage into your rivers, what do you expect? That cholera will take a vacation. Imagine this, a bustling medieval city, streets slick with horse dung, butcher blood and human waste. All of it conveniently sloped down into public streams. And guess what? The baker uses that water for not just washing his hands, proofing your daily bread. The same river that witnessed a cow decompose is now seasoning your crust. Bon appetit. When plague struck, people didn't exactly connect the dots. Germ theory was centuries away. Their reaction, burn witches, or wear dead birds on their faces. Medical masks of the time were basically plague-themed cosplay. But no one said, hey, maybe we shouldn't dump bodies into the same well we drink from. Why? Because logic had left the building, probably running from the stench. The Black Death spread faster than gossip in a royal court. One sneeze in London, and 2 weeks later, Paris was coughing up a lung. You could die faster than it took to heat up soup. Though let's be honest, nobody was boiling anything anyway. Why would they? Water wasn't for boiling. It was for dying slowly over the course of 4 agonizing days, while your lymph nodes turned into murder balloons. Here's the kicker. Some towns worsen the problem trying to fix it. They dig trenches to drain sewage straight into their neighbour's water source. Medieval diplomacy at its finest. We have a waste problem. Let's make it your problem too. Cities tried quarantines, but that usually just meant locking sick people in their homes and pretending everything was fine. Meanwhile, the well outside kept bubbling with gifts from Mother Death herself. And then there were the water sellers. Yes, people sold water. Imagine standing in a hot market square buying a wooden cup of lukewarm bacteria-rich sludge for a week's wage. If that sounds like a terrible idea, it's because it was. But in the absence of safe wells, shady water vendors became the fast food of disease quick dirty and guaranteed to ruin your afternoon. Water wasn't just dangerous, it was invisible warfare. The upper classes had private springs. Everyone else played Russian roulette with a bucket. Rich people boiled their tea, poor people drank whatever puddle they could reach, and they died for it. Inequality didn't just affect housing or food, it was baked into the bacteria count of your beverage. Let's pause and admire the absurdity. You're in 1348. Your neighbour just dropped dead. Your cousin is leaking black ooze. The priest tells you to pray harder, and you take a swig of river juice with bits in it. That's not water. That's hope marinated in filth. And yet it was all they had. By the time the plague had finished its tour, it wiped out anywhere from 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population. Think about that. Every second person gone. Entire villages silent. Fields empty. Wells untouched, not because people finally got smart, but because no one was left alive to drink from them. What's worse is that this was preventable. Not by modern medicine, just by not drinking poop water. But society wasn't built that way. Sanitation was witchcraft. Boiling water was suspicious. And washing hands unmanly. Real men eat mud and survive or don't was the accidental slogan of an entire millennium. So yes, rats and fleas had their moment in the medieval horror show. But the real MVP of mass death, good old-fashioned contaminated water. Always there, always underestimated, always lethal. Like the quiet guy at the party who ends up burning the place down. Modern plumbing isn't just a convenience, it's a miracle. Every time you flush a toilet or sip from a clean tap, you're defying centuries of rot ignorance and public fountains full of disease gravy. Raise a glass, preferably of water that hasn't touched a corpse, and thank the forgotten victims of the bubonic bacteria party. Their lymph nodes died for your luxury. Because in medieval times, water wasn't just dirty, it was a weapon of mass putrefaction. Imagine waking up, stretching your arms, walking outside with a bucket, and tossing your bodily sins directly into a stream. Congratulations, you've just performed medieval plumbing. There was no concept of indoor bathroom unless you were royalty, and even they had to get creative. For everyone else, water flowed not around human waste but through it. That babbling brook. It wasn't babbling, it was gagging. Let's be brutally clear, rivers were toilets. Open-shared, cold and unapologetic. The stream next to your home served triple duty. It gave you water, received your waste, and then came back to haunt your digestive system, like a vengeful spirit. Washing your face with water that just passed someone's last meal is not an act of survival, it's performance art. The only thing medieval peasants shared more than gossip was gastrointestinal bacteria. Now, if you lived in a city, things got fancier in a horrible way. Welcome to the garderobe. It's a French word meaning clothes closet because nobles used to hang clothes above their latrines thinking the smell would ward off moths. Charming. A garderobe was essentially a stone seat with a hole cantilevered over a castle wall. Whatever exited your body plunged into a moat street or neighbour's courtyard. Ah, medieval architecture, beautiful from a distance, deadly from beneath. These weren't isolated accidents. Medieval toilets were built to ensure your contribution made it into a public water system. Streams became open-air digestive tracts of entire towns. Every flush, if you can even call it that, was a donation to the downstream lottery of dysentery. You don't drink from the river, you survive it, or you don't. And let's talk about bridges. You might think of them as romantic cobbled walkways. Medieval folks thought of them as multi-user toilet platforms. Yes, entire families would relieve themselves through designated toilet holes built right into bridges. So the next time you see a picturesque medieval bridge in a fantasy movie, just remember it once rained feces into a drinking stream. Richer households used chamber pots, essentially fancy buckets. But guess what they did with those buckets in the morning? Dumped them into the streets or rivers. Sometimes with a polite gardez-lou shouted from the window, a term derived from the French gardez-lou, meaning watch out for the water. Imagine being warned that you're about to be baptized in your neighbour's digestive regrets. The church wasn't much better. Monasteries had their own latrine systems that drained straight into nearby water, because holiness doesn't make you poop less, and pilgrims. They lived on the road, squatting behind bushes, temples, and sometimes each other. If a town had more visitors than toilets, which was always you could trace the smell before you saw the church bell, you may be wondering, didn't they care about smell? Of course. That's why they carried scented handkerchiefs, stuffed herbs into their nostrils, and blamed bad air miasma for disease. They treated the stink like a spiritual punishment, not an indicator that their toilets were rivers with flow problems. To solve the crisis, burn incense, not fix drainage. One of the most infamous examples was London's Fleet River, a river that went from source of life to open sewer in record time. The name Fleet Ditch became a punchline by the 17th century, but the filth was well underway centuries earlier. By the 1300s, people were falling in and emerging as walking diseases, or not emerging at all. Getting swept away in a river of feces is not just tragic, it's a metaphor for the Middle Ages. And then there's the seasonal horror. In summer, rivers dried up, concentrating their sludge into thick, bubbling nightmares. In winter, everything froze, which meant chamber pots had to wait. And when thaw came, nature unleashed the great poo flood. Imagine entire town squares marinating in frozen turds. History books don't tell you this, but the smell it wrote its own. Did anyone try to fix this occasionally? Some towns passed laws banning waste dumping into rivers, but enforcement was a joke. Imagine a peasant constable running after a woman shouting gardez-lou holding a dripping bucket. Not exactly CSI Medieval Edition. The only consistent rule was out of sight, out of smell. If it flowed away, it was someone else's problem. This all created a sort of biological arms race. As cities grew, so did their sewage. Rivers became hostile ecosystems of floating offal, rotting meat, menstrual cloths, and the occasional floating pig carcass. And right next to that, kids playing, women washing clothes, and animals drinking. If bacteria could write thank you notes, the Middle Ages would be flooded with them, and yet they survived. Barely. The human body is either incredibly resilient or just too stubborn to give up. They died young, but not always. Some lived to see 30, maybe 40, long enough to train a child how to aim for the river without slipping in. Hygiene wasn't a luxury. It was a dangerous mystery they never solved. In conclusion, when someone says those were simpler times, remind them that their toilet was your drinking water. Rivers didn't flow through medieval towns. They flowed through their intestines. You don't need a time machine to appreciate progress. Just flush a toilet. Then thank science plumbing and the fact that your bridge doesn't come with a poop chute. Because back then the toilet wasn't in the stream. The toilet was the stream. Let's get one thing straight. If you were stepping into a medieval bathhouse, you weren't just going in for a rinse. You were entering a full-blown sensory roller coaster. Steam sweat, fermented towel rot and moans, some from relaxation, others from economic negotiations. The line between spa day and sin den was blurrier than the water itself. And by the way, yes, people bathed together naked often, in water that had seen more bodies than a battlefield. Hygiene was optional. Gossip was mandatory. Bathhouses weren't some hygienic haven carved out from the squalor of medieval cities. They were loud, social, occasionally violent, and smelled like a soup made of feet and candle wax. The water was rarely changed, just heated and reused like a community tea bag. Imagine hopping into a tub where 5 drunk guys had just washed off a week's worth of dung, then invited their dates in for negotiations. Add medieval perfume, a mix of rose oil and desperation, and you've got yourself a medieval spa experience. Don't get me wrong, bathing wasn't illegal yet, but it definitely carried reputational risk. Local clergy had a meltdown over the nakedness and temptations lurking beneath the steam. Some bathhouses even employed musicians to drown out the sounds of both scrubbing and screwing. In London, stew houses became infamous for offering both meat pies and human thighs, sometimes in the same transaction. Imagine trying to clean your armpits while the guy in the next stall negotiates his hourly rate. And here's the kicker, people still got excited about it. For many, the bathhouse was their version of a nightclub mixed with a Tinder date, and maybe a dose of cholera. You didn't just go for the bath. You went to be seen, to show off your new wool tunic or the mole on your thigh shaped like the Virgin Mary. Of course you'd leave with fewer coins and more rashes, but that was just Tuesday. Some cities eventually cracked down. Public bathhouses were shut down not because they were dirty, but because they were immoral. That's right. Medieval people tolerated open sewage but drew the line at consensual nudity. Priorities, baby. Paris shut most down by the late 15th century. In Nuremberg, they tried enforcing separation of genders, which shockingly turned out to be as effective as using a bucket with no bottom. People still snuck in, still got sweaty, and still left with souvenirs that needed more than soap, and soap that deserves its own horror story. Medieval soap wasn't a cute bar of lavender leather. It was more like an oily brick of ashes, lard and lye. It peeled your skin faster than your sins. Many just skipped it and hoped that enough rosewater would distract from their body's tragic poem. Spoiler, it didn't. Hence, bathhouses reeked of both effort and failure. It was like trying to put out a dumpster fire with cologne. Let's not forget the health implications. Sitting in hot, stale, shared water was basically an invitation for every bacteria to throw a house party on your skin. Warts, boils, mystery bumps, you name it. If someone in the tub had syphilis, congratulations, now everyone does. It was like drinking from a communal straw, except you were sipping skin juice. And remember, this was still better than washing in a river full of dead pigs and old shoes. The bath attendants. They weren't health inspectors. They were more like medieval party hosts. They'd stoke the fire, hand you a towel, possibly already used, and politely look away as your massage appointment got a bit interactive. They might offer you wine, bring in entertainment, or just sell you a scented rag. Hygiene had turned into an industry, one that didn't care about bacteria, but sure as hell understood profit. So why did people still go? Because they had to. If you wanted to court someone, build status, or just not be that one guy who smells like fermented turnip water, you braved the bathhouse. You bathed once a week on a good week. Maybe even got a haircut from a man who also pulled teeth. The lines between professions were as blurry as the bath water. Barbers, healers, and bathhouse workers all lived in the same weird, hygiene-adjacent universe. The irony: the more church and government tried to suppress bathhouses, the worse public health got. When bathhouses closed, people didn't magically build bathtubs at home. They just stopped washing. By the time of the plague, many truly believed water could carry disease not because it was contaminated, but because it opened your skin to bad spirits. So they wore layers and perfume and died. So next time you light a candle, pour a hot bath and sink into clean chlorinated heaven. Remember in the Middle Ages that same act would have been a scandalous, disease-ridden social event, with a side of syphilis and possibly a lute solo. Your bathroom is not just a bathroom. It's a shrine to everything we've learned about not boiling in each other's filth. You stroll into a medieval village and think smells charming. You're wrong. It smells like everything died fermented or was cooked poorly often all at the same time. Goat carcasses bobbing in puddles, human waste drying in the sun, smoke from chimneys, baking bread and rotting dung all competing in an olfactory thunderdome. It wasn't just a bit ripe. It was Dante-level funhouse. Village life was an oral and olfactory assault. Streets had no pavement, so rain turned filth into ankle-deep sludge. Sun baked it into concrete teasing at your nostrils. Every step splashed funk up your legs. By noon, you smelled like someone who lost a fight with a sheep in a clay oven. And no, nobody carried deodorant. Everyone shared the village odour pool: men, women, children, animals. There was no filter. You couldn't step outside without inhaling your neighbour's laundry livestock and lamentations. People just grew accustomed to living inside their own stench soup. They carried it around like a badge. Clean meant suspicious, but sometimes someone smelled worse than the consensus, and that was a status no one wanted. The stink wasn't just nuisance. People linked bad air miasma to disease. They believed illness rode on evil smells. So they doused their clothes houses and pets in herbs, incense and vinegar. It didn't work, but it felt like action. Tart wine-soaked sponges under the nose became status symbols. If you couldn't smell the rotting pig, you were clearly above common suffering. It might have been delusion, but it was delicious. If you worked with animals, the stakes were higher. Butchers dumped entrails into the street. Tanners soaked hides in urine, not just any urine. Animal urine. Multiple animal urine. It smelled like swooning goats. And then you had fullers who washed wool in human urine again. The air above their workshops became toxic soup. Locals avoided them, which basically made tanners medieval ghost towns. Meanwhile, livestock roamed free through lanes. Chickens scratched beneath open windows. Pigs rooted cider barrels. Horses left nuggets in doorways. You couldn't escape the smell. It wasn't just everywhere, it was everyone. Even the church pews carried the lingering aroma of barnyard devotion. In holy stink we rise. Life inside homes was slightly better, if you could call it that. People kept fire burning, which masked smells with soot. Houses reeked of peat smoke and animal fat. Straw mattresses expired on top of stench. There was no ventilation. Every breath tasted like yesterday's rot, and you cooked in it. Medieval home fragrance didn't exist. The best they got was when a breeze blew past. Some communities fought back. They dug trenches or placed chambers beneath houses to collect waste. They built ditches on roads and scattered lime to sweeten the air. Criminal names were stenciled on latrines as shame deterrents. Town charters even banned dumping within city limits, but without policing it was just graffiti on poop. Laws existed. Enforcement comedy. Markets were the worst. Overcrowded, underpaved, and full of spoiled goods. Vegetables wilted in the sun, fish stank poolside, and meat sweated foul juice. Vendors waved vinegar-soaked cloths to attract buyers and mask their stalls. No one dared complain. What was the alternative? Going hungry. So they ate it, believing a bit fermented builds immunity. Mostly it built regret. The smell even shaped culture. Poems lamented village odour rare because villagers wrote little. Church sermons decried the stench of sin with gusto. Folk songs mentioned sweethearts with breath that smelled of dung, and suitors who fled in tears. They found humour in it, but mainly as coping. Humour about breathless stink is survival humour, not comedic gold. And there were seasons. Spring was a promise of renewal, until the thaw released a year's backlog of rot. Summer baked smells into cement. Autumn brought harvest stench compounded by dying crops. Winter froze odours into permanent memory. Then each thaw returned them in full force. It was a never-ending fragrance cycle with no aromatherapy bonus. Visitors from other villages often collapsed from shock. There were cases of travellers choking mid-word, turning round and fleeing back to where the fresh air came from. Traders built perfumes into their price. Fresh flowers included said one in France. That's medieval Yelp. Quality water was impossible, but a whiff of lavender could fetch a higher rate. Peasants probably never thought, I want to smell nice. They thought, well, I still have clothing that isn't soaked in pig shit. Small victories. If your clothes could air dry without maggots, you considered that a win. Adding a sprig of rosemary luxurious. Going a week without neighbour pig filth invading your nostrils miraculous. Later, some towns improved sanitation, paved roads, sewers, street sweepers. London filled its walled moat and replaced it with parks. Hygiene reforms began. The stench retreated. But centuries of breathing filth shaped attitudes. Smell became associated with poverty, education, moral decay. The silent marker of social status, your scent told your story. Now imagine living in that stink. You couldn't sleep away from it. You woke with it. You died in it. And yet they survived. Loved, laughed, built communities all through a miasma of grotesque stench. That's resilience. That's humanity. So next time someone says medieval life was authentic, check your nose. Authentic is not having your lungs pickled in decay. But remember they endured. And those enduring breaths built everything we have today, including our sewage systems, air filters and deodorants. Because once upon a time everything smelled like everything, and everyone survived. In the Middle Ages, your clothes didn't just say who you were. They said what you'd stepped in how many days ago, and possibly who had worn them before you. To a modern nose, medieval fashion was less about thread count and more about odour count. You didn't just wear fabric. You wore a personal ecosystem of grime sweat, smoke grease, and occasionally plague. And somehow it was all still considered fashionable. Wool was the go-to fabric. It was warm and durable and famously water-resistant, which also meant it was excellent at trapping sweat and barn smells. Linen was used for underclothes if you were lucky enough to have them, but washing even those was a seasonal affair. Most folks had only 1 or 2 changes of clothing. Your Sunday best was likely your only shirt, and if it rained, everything stuck to your body like a damp sack of vegetables left in a cellar. Fashion was layered not for style, but for survival. The more layers you wore, the less dirt reached your skin. Outer tunics bore the brunt of filth, so undergarments lasted longer. It was a strategy to accumulate stink in manageable stages. Peasants wore shorter tunics for work. Noblemen flaunted longer robes, and everyone shared one thing: dirt was inevitable. Whether you harvested turnips or collected taxes, mud had a way of becoming your most consistent accessory. People didn't wash their clothes often because it was labour-intensive. Washing meant hauling water, heating it, making lye soap scrubbing by hand, and drying garments in sun or smoke. A single wash could take hours, and since many believed water could weaken cloth fibres, or let evil vapours in, they simply brushed, beat, or aired their clothes. Washing ruins good wool, they said. It was medieval dry cleaning minus the cleaning. Smell was a social language. A noble might wear rose petals sewn into sleeves or lavender tied in satchels, not to please others but to protect their nostrils. A merchant might perfume a doublet with cloves. But the average farmer, they masked their odour with stronger odours, smoke from peat fires, crushed mint or garlic rubbed under arms. If you ever wondered why garlic was a staple in medieval life, it didn't just scare off vampires, it scared off people too. Even armour had its funk. Knights in shining mail didn't sparkle beneath banners, they reeked of rust, sweat leather grease and months-old padding. Gambesons, the quilted jackets worn under chainmail, soaked up every drop of exertion and never got washed. March through summer fields in one of those and you didn't need a sword to repel enemies. You just needed to raise your arms. Shoes told a dirtier story. Most were made of leather thin-soled stitched and absolutely not waterproof. The streets of a medieval town weren't roads, they were obstacle courses of dung offal, wastewater and fallen produce. So your shoes soaked it up like sponges, and socks a luxury. Some stuffed moss or straw into their shoes, others just dealt with foot rot as part of the ensemble. Colour and cut were status markers, but keeping them clean, optional. These were expensive, so brighter garments were prized, even if stained. A tunic with embroidery and vomit stains was still better than a plain clean one. Wealthy people flaunted fashion the same way we flaunt tech, except instead of having the newest gadget, they had the bluest hemline even if it smelled like goat soup. Style, scent. There were trends, of course. Pointed shoes, polanes were all the rage for a time, even if they collected mud like miniature gutters. Oversized sleeves, impressive, until they dragged through the marketplace and picked up bits of fish and cheese. Long trains on gowns meant elegance and also meant 2 feet of grime following you like a faithful dog. Clothes weren't just worn, they were experienced. Headwear was functional, but no cleaner. Hoods, coifs, veils, and caps absorbed sweat and soot. A peasant's hood doubled as a noseguard in foul weather. A nun's coif was sacred, but smelled like the chapel's last incense session, plus a few decades of silent meals. Hats were passed down, not washed. And the lice. Let's just say your head wasn't your own kingdom. Perfume did exist, but it wasn't Chanel. Medieval scents were made from flowers, resin, spices, and even animal byproducts. Civet musk came from the glands of civet cat's ambergris from whale intestines. These weren't dainty floral notes, they were beastly. And yet nobles paid fortunes to dab these powerful smells onto collars and gloves. In a world that stank an overpowering animal musk was considered a social upgrade. Even monks weren't immune. While they lived simple lives, their robes were rarely washed. Their sandals collected chapel dust and their cells were musty with books and old bread. Holiness didn't equal hygiene. Some saints were praised for never changing clothes, letting them rot as a sign of spiritual detachment. Dirt was devotion. You couldn't buy that kind of filth at the market. Clothing became a kind of biography. A farmer's tunic might carry traces of wheat chaff manure and stew drippings. A blacksmith's apron held burn marks, grease and soot smears. A washerwoman's gown would be soaked, wrinkled, and occasionally frozen. Even children had their uniforms of earth stains, berry juice, and dog hair. Everyone wore their life on their sleeve, literally. Tailoring wasn't personal unless you were wealthy. Most people bought second-hand garments, patched them endlessly, or shared with family. Clothes had lineage. A dress might serve mother, daughter, niece, then neighbour. Repair was survival. A well-mended tunic was more respected than a new one because it meant the wearer had skills, resourcefulness, and a needle that hadn't broken yet. Fashion became theatre for those who could afford it. Kings commissioned robes lined with squirrel fur, yes, red squirrel was luxury. Queens paraded in dresses heavy with embroidery and pearls, but under the layers, same as everyone else. Sweat, lard-based hair, products, and desperation. Courtiers may have looked polished, but the smell behind closed doors could still raise eyebrows or collapse lungs. Textiles themselves contributed to the problem. Unfinished wool was oily and itchy. Hemp was scratchy. Silk was rare and expensive, but easily stained. Leather absorbed every bodily secretion, and washing methods were well medieval. Urine was often used to treat stains. Yes, urine. Because when life gives you pee, you make laundry detergent. As time progressed, sumptuary laws were created to control fashion. Only the elite could wear certain colours, fabrics, or trims. Peasants were forbidden to mimic noble styles, even if they could afford them. Fashion became a weaponised class system, but it didn't change the shared truth. Nobody rich or poor smelled great. Everyone was fashionably filthy. Some tried to escape the grime. Pilgrims might leave town believing the road cleansed the soul, but even then the journey made them sweat. Their clothes clung and dust became their second skin. The road didn't clean, it just changed the scenery. And by the time they reached a holy site, their tunic looked like a medieval oil painting full of mystery layers and questionable textures. In winter, people layered more, washed less, and huddled together. The smell of unwashed wool feet and wet dogs filled every hut. In summer, sweat turned tunics translucent. There was no winning, only surviving. And fashion in this age meant understanding that stink was the signature scent of survival. So when you imagine a medieval person in a fine cloak or embroidered gown, remember beneath it all was grime. Not because they were dirty by choice, but because they dressed for life. A life full of toil, earth, smoke and hope. And somehow, despite it all, they still managed to create beauty. They painted, they danced, they stitched stories into sleeves and futures into threadbare hems, because even when you stink, you can still shine. For medieval women, water was not a luxury, it was labour and lots of it. From sunrise to sundown, their lives revolved around fetching, carrying, boiling, scrubbing and enduring water in its most unpleasant forms. It soaked their skirts, cracked their hands, and ruined what little comfort they might have scraped together in their modest homes. Water didn't arrive with convenience. It had to be earned, lifted, walked with, and worried over, because to spill it was to repeat an hour's work. Fetching water was a task so routine that it was nearly invisible to history, yet it defined daily life. Women and girls walked for miles with wooden buckets or clay jugs, balancing them on their heads or hips. A trip to the village well wasn't just a chore. It was a gamble on weather, on safety, and on how many rats might have died in the well overnight. Water could taste like iron, sulphur, or dead things. But it was better than nothing, and nothing was always lurking. Even in towns with fountains or cisterns, queues could stretch long and tempers short. Fights erupted over cutting in line or accusations of stealing extra pailfuls. There was no privacy, no guarantee of clean supply, and no choice but to endure it. The strong shouldered 2 full buckets with a yoke across the back, while the weak spilled, staggered and prayed their arms wouldn't give out. It was a quiet sort of heroism, carrying the weight of survival every single day. Once home, the water was far from ready for use. It had to be heated over open flame, a dangerous and temperamental process. Wood was scarce, and fire took time. A woman had to guess how much water she'd need before even starting. Cooking, washing clothes, bathing children, cleaning vegetables, it all demanded hot water. And if she miscalculated, it meant starting again. There were no knobs, no safety valves, only intuition and burns. Washing clothes was the medieval equivalent of running a triathlon in mud. Garments were soaked, scrubbed on rough stones or wooden boards, and then wrung out with stiff, aching arms. Soap, when available, was harsh and homemade, often from animal fat and lye. It ate away at skin and made eyes water. Women knelt by rivers surrounded by frogs, fish bones and floating trash, hoping the current would carry away more than just dirt. Privacy was a laughable idea. Women often bathed children or themselves behind crude curtains, if any, or in shared rooms with family members. Modesty bowed before practicality. Girls learned early that water was for work, not leisure. A bath was a complicated affair that required time tubs and warmth, all three hard to find together. Most women bathed rarely and hurriedly, more out of duty than pleasure. And then there were the bodily realities. Menstruation was a private struggle turned public misery. There were no sanitary pads, no painkillers, no hot water bottles. Old cloth scraps were used and reused, washed as best as possible in cold streams. Women bled in silence, cursed their luck and endured cramps while stoking fires and baking bread. Water didn't soothe them, it mocked them with its filth, its chill and its constant demands. Pregnancy added another layer of water woe. Clean water was vital but elusive during childbirth. Women boiled cloths, scalded basins, and hoped the midwife's hands were clean enough. Contaminated water could lead to infection and death, but what choice did they have? Wells were shallow, rivers were shared with pigs, and rainfall came with bird droppings. The miracle of birth often came with the tragedy of contaminated hands. Child-rearing was a wet business in all the worst ways. Babies soiled linens faster than they could be scrubbed. Children drank from bucket-stirred puddles and got sick from water their mothers fetched in good faith. Diarrhea, rashes and rot were common, and mothers bore the blame. If a child died, whispers followed, was the water clean? Did she wash the linen? As if love could scrub away disease with bare hands and lukewarm wells. For women who worked outside the home, water troubles only grew. Brewsters, washerwomen and midwives relied on a constant supply of water to earn a living. They fought for space at rivers, argued over clean spots, and suffered when droughts dried up their income. Their hands were always red raw and wet, and when they went home the same tasks awaited them all over again. Even in monasteries, nuns weren't spared. Cloistered life came with daily chores, and many were water-related. Convent kitchens boiled endless stews, and linen washing was a holy duty. Silence was required, but grunts, slips and splashes told their own story. In cold months, water froze in basins before hands could reach it. God might love a clean soul, but he seemed less invested in warm fingers. Water also dictated women's social space. Wells and fountains became informal gathering spots where news, gossip and warnings were exchanged, but they were also sites of judgment. A woman seen fetching water too early or too late raised questions. Was she meeting someone? Was she lazy? Was she cursed? The simple act of filling a bucket became a daily performance of virtue. Marriage brought no escape. Husbands expected water for washing, cooking and brewing. Complaints about heavy buckets or sore backs were dismissed. Women's work meant no excuse, and if water ran out, the woman took the blame. No one asked if the well had dried or if the woodpile was empty. Her failure to boil meant cold meals, stained tunics and family scorn. Widows suffered doubly. Without a man to carry buckets or chop wood, they relied on neighbours' charity or failing limbs. The community pitied them, then grew resentful. They were seen as burdens, even as they risked frostbite to fetch water for the dying. Independence didn't mean freedom. It meant double the work and half the help. Old women knew the patterns of water like scripture. They could smell a rotten well, predict a freeze, and locate the softest bend of a stream for washing. They were living archives of water knowledge passed on in whispers, gestures and warnings, but their wisdom often went ignored, until a child fell sick, until the water turned green, until the river gave back a corpse. Water was weaponized against women too. Accusations of witchcraft often included water-based proofs, drowning tests where a woman was tied and thrown into water to see if she floated became brutal jokes. Float and you're guilty. Sink and you're innocent, but also dead. It was justice by bucket, and it was always women who paid. Even at death, water played a role. Washing the dead was women's work. They bathed the bodies, dressed them, and prepared them for burial. All with water they fetched themselves. It was a sacred act, performed with cracked fingers and heavy breath. No one thanked them. But the dead were clean for once, and the water was red, then poured away. The irony was bitter water, which symbolized purity, was a source of endless toil. It ruined hand-stained garments and carried disease, yet it was expected to make things clean. Women bent their lives around it, carried it, boiled it, feared it, needed it. It shaped their days and soaked their bones. But it never lifted them. And yet women endured. They adapted. They shared tips, stories and secrets at the well. They soaked herbs to fight infections, boiled flowers to mask smells, and sang to children while scrubbing rags. They turned water from curse to craft, and in doing so, they carved out moments of grace from the drudgery. So the next time you picture a medieval village, don't just see castles or knights. See the woman at dawn lifting a bucket with both hands, mud on her skirt hair in her eyes, and a child pulling at her sleeve. Her feet ache, her back throbs, and the water sloshes over the rim. But she walks on, because in her world water doesn't rest, and neither can she. In the heart of every medieval village there was always a well. It might have been lined with stone covered with a timber roof, or surrounded by muddy footprints and discarded rags, but it was always there, dark, deep, and humming with unseen voices. The well wasn't just a water source, it was a social crossroads, a superstitious focal point, and on more than one occasion a scene of unexplainable horror. People swore they heard things, whispers rising with the wind echoes that didn't belong to any bucket splash. They called it the scream of the well, and no one quite agreed on what it meant. Some said it was the spirits of drowned souls trapped in the black throat of the earth. Others claimed it was the sound of water crying after being forced to serve such filthy human needs. A few insisted it was just wind, just echoes, just imagination, but they were always the ones who never fetched water themselves. Women and children, the ones who had to peer into that endless dark and lower their buckets with shaking ropes, heard something different. Not words exactly, more like a feeling that something was awake down there waiting, listening. Wells were dangerous and everyone knew it. Children were warned never to play near them. Horses were spooked by the sound of pulleys, and cats refused to drink the water unless it had been poured into a clean bowl. People fell in, drunk men lost pets, curious toddlers, and when they did, there wasn't always a rescue. Sometimes the rope broke, sometimes no one heard the splash, and sometimes the body never came back up. In those cases, the village changed. People walked a little faster past the well. They whispered more. Bread tasted off soup boiled strangely, and dreams became feverish and dark. It was as if the well held a grudge, as if it remembered what had been dropped into it willingly or not. And from then on, even the clearest water had the faint taste of sorrow. Wells weren't pure, not by any modern standard. Waste from animals and humans leaked into the ground. Rainwater carried every speck of dung and ash from nearby roads straight into the water table. In times of heavy rainfall, the water turned cloudy, then brown, then still. Villagers who drank it fell sick with cramps, vomiting, and hallucinations. Some said the well was cursed. Others said it was simply full. To prevent sickness, some wells were blessed by priests or sprinkled with herbs and ashes. In desperate times, they were covered with stone lids and forgotten. In even more desperate times, they were used as graveyards. During plagues, when burial space ran out and no one dared touch the bodies, corpses were tossed into wells. Mothers, sons, priests, thieves, all tumbled into the same pit of water meant for tomorrow's soup. The screams, they said, got louder after that. There are records quiet and chilling of wells being sealed by villagers without explanation. A priest scribbled a note in the margin of a church inventory. The lower well sings again, God help us. Another mentioned a girl who ran from the rope, pale as chalk, and would not say what she saw. Still another story tells of a well that began to bubble in winter when all should have been frozen. They poured salt around it. They built a wall, but no one ever touched its water again. It wasn't just ghosts or disease. Wells were also battlegrounds. In sieges, enemy forces poisoned village wells with dead animals or with rotting meat. A single bloated goat could ruin a town's only source of water. In times of suspicion, neighbours accused each other of tampering with the well, adding herbs to hex it, or urinating into it out of spite. Witchcraft trials often included charges of well fouling, a crime punishable by fire, or drowning ironically, sometimes in the same water they were accused of cursing. But for all their danger, wells were essential. Rivers were too far. Rain was too unpredictable. And carrying water from streams meant braving wolves, bandits, and worse. So people returned to the well day after day, roped bucket in hand. They muttered blessings, avoided looking down, and never leaned in too far. And when the pulley squeaked too slowly or the rope snagged on something unexpected, they closed their eyes and pulled faster. Children invented games to distract themselves. They dropped pebbles and counted the seconds before the splash. They whispered secrets and listened for the well to reply. Some tied dolls to string and lowered them as brave explorers. But sometimes the dolls didn't come back, or came back soaked and stained with something darker than mud. The game stopped. The well remained. Not all wells screamed. Some were silent, but that silence had weight. A silence so thick you could feel it pressing on your skin as you leaned in. Travellers reported unease around quiet wells in foreign towns. They'd lower their bucket and find it stuck halfway down as if something was holding it. One legend tells of a knight who heard his own name whispered back to him, faint and feminine. He left the village that night and never returned. Water drawn from screaming wells was used carefully. Some would only use it to wash floors. Others gave it to animals but never drank it themselves. A few believed it held special power that if you whispered a prayer into it before drawing the bucket, the water would hear your wish. Those people sometimes found coins at the bottom of their buckets, and sometimes fingernails. In dry years, wells dried up entirely and then the screaming stopped. Villagers sighed in relief, but the fear didn't vanish. What if the screams had moved to the next village? What if they were just sleeping? Desperate men and women dug new wells deeper and wider, hoping for better results. But the deeper the well, the darker the water, and the deeper the fear. Women spoke of dreams where the well rose like a mouth wide and grinning. Men refused to fetch water at dusk. Children drew pictures of eyes peering out from beneath the bucket. No one wanted to believe the well was alive, but no one could explain why it felt that way. Why the ropes frayed too often. Why voices sometimes echoed back words you hadn't said aloud. The worst wells, they said, didn't scream at all, they laughed. Stories spread through the region. One village built a chapel directly over their well, trying to silence it. Another filled theirs with salt and lime and never drank again. Pilgrims visited some wells, believing they were holy, even miraculous. They bathed in the water, prayed beside it, and praised its healing powers. Then sometimes they fell sick. The saints were silent. The water was not. By the 14th century, some towns began building public fountains fed by underground pipes, trying to escape the risks of open wells. But most villages were too poor, too remote, and so the screaming wells remained generation after generation. Their stones grew moss, their rims wore smooth under endless hands, and their echoes never quite died. Even when forgotten, they lingered, the kind of silence that holds breath. One day, perhaps, the well would be buried, a new house built over it, a garden planted. A child might stumble on the stone cover, lift it out of curiosity. Then the scream might return or not. The terror wasn't just in what the well did, it was in what it remembered. A black mirror to the human soul, thirsty, bottomless, and never truly clean. So in the end, a well in medieval life was never just a hole for water. It was a portal, a grave, a judge, a keeper of secrets too deep for daylight. Villagers lived beside it, feared it drank from it, and listened. Because when the well screamed, it wasn't just water warning them. It was the past and everything buried with it. Rain was a miracle, a mystery, and a menace, all rolled into one sodden, dripping, skyborne package. In the medieval mind, it could mean salvation for your fields or death by flood. It could soak your roof until your ceiling collapsed or fall so sparingly that you're well dried into a pit of cracked regrets. Rain was unpredictable, untamable, and largely misunderstood, which made it both revered and feared. And when it didn't come, when weeks passed under a sun that mocked your prayers, people danced. These weren't elegant, choreographed performances. They were muddy, barefoot scrambles by desperate villagers who spun in circles, shook dried branches, and muttered half-remembered Latin under their breath. Sometimes the priest led the procession holding a cross above his head and imploring God to break open the heavens. Other times it was the village full drunk and half naked howling to the sky while children clapped along. But always at the root of it was one primal hope: let something fall from the sky. Anything. It wasn't just crops at stake, it was survival. Without rain, the grain withered. The animals drank foul water and died. Bread became thinner, darker, bitter. Illness crept in like fog, slow and stubborn. Mothers whispered over their children's beds, wondering whether this cough was from the heat, the water, or the devil himself. In some places, entire communities walked in silence through the fields, heads bowed, hoping humility would soften the heavens. In others, people sang, or wailed, or whipped themselves with reeds as if punishing their own flesh might inspire mercy. Children were sometimes made to walk naked through the streets, their innocence meant to charm the clouds. Animals were paraded, icons were washed. In one case, a man was buried up to his neck in dirt and told to pray until the first drop fell. Rain had theology. It was seen as divine will, a punishment, or a blessing. If your village was dry while the next one thrived, it wasn't just meteorology, it was morality. Someone had sinned. Someone had failed to tithe. Or perhaps your priest was less holy than theirs. Suspicion took root as fast as thirst. Neighbours eyed one another. The baker who didn't attend mass. The widow who kept cats. The boy who talked to birds. Superstition flared. Amulets were hung in doorways. Crosses were carved into fence posts. Wives whispered to husbands, urging them not to speak ill of the sky. And always the dancing returned. Louder, wilder. Sometimes it worked, or seemed to. Clouds gathered, thunder rolled. A drop kissed the earth and sent children shrieking in delight. People knelt in the dirt and opened their mouths to the sky. For a moment it was holy, sacred. Then it passed. The disappointment was worse than the drought. A tease of moisture followed by more heat. The ground cracked. Leaves curled. Chickens died with their beaks open. Wells became sludge. Even the stream slowed to a crawl, revealing bones, broken tools, and foul smells no one could blame on the devil. Men sat in silence. Women wept. No one danced for a week. But desperation always returns. And so the dances did too, evolving into stranger forms. In one village, people climbed the church roof and shouted prayers at the weathercock. In another, they tied scraps of cloth to trees and beat the trunks with sticks. Still others crafted crude effigies of clouds and burned them in hopes that smoke would remind the sky what to do. None of it was logical. But neither was the suffering. Stories spread of magical rainmakers, wandering monks who brought rain with a chant, wise women who whispered to puddles and turned them into storms. Most of these were fantasy, of course, but in a world where water meant life, people clung to any tale that offered relief. So if a stranger walked into town with wet boots during a drought, he became a saint at least until his feet dried. Children were taught to mimic frogs, to croak like toads and slap the mud with their palms. If the earth was made to feel like rain had already come, perhaps it would follow. That was the logic anyway. Medieval science was often more poetry than proof. And when you're parched, poetry is a form of survival. There were those who tried to engineer rain rudimentary efforts involving fire and steam. Some believed that smoke rose high enough to agitate the clouds. Others thought boiling herbs released vapours the sky craved. So they lit bonfires, sometimes laced with rosemary and garlic, as if trying to summon both weather and protection from the plague. These rituals left the air thick, sticky, and still rainless, but they gave people a sense of doing something, of not waiting to die dry-mouthed and dust-covered. The church disapproved of most of it. Dancing was frowned upon. Singing to the sky bordered on paganism. Some priests threatened excommunication for those who joined in the rain rituals. Others quietly joined themselves, hidden under hoods, muttering psalms alongside herbal chants. When rain finally came, if it came, the credit went to God no matter who did the dancing. Even kings got involved. There are records of royal decrees ordering nationwide prayer days during which no labour was to be done except praying for water. Bells rang from every cathedral. Choirs sang litanies that rolled like thunder through the cities. And still, sometimes the sky stayed dry. The problem with divine weather is that divinity rarely answers letters. There were years when the rains never truly returned. Entire communities moved. Fields were abandoned, churches crumbled. People wandered, searching for a place where the grass was still green. These were called hunger years, and they left scars deeper than war. In their wake, songs were written, strange lullabies that asked clouds to weep upon us soft and slow. Children grew up singing them without knowing the pain behind the words. Even when rain did come, it came wrong. A deluge that flattened fields collapsed. Roofs drowned the piglets in their pens. Rain that didn't soak the soil but rushed over it carrying topsoil and hope alike. Rivers swelled with such fury that bridges cracked and mills spun wild. And then it stopped again. Dryness returned like a thief stealing breath, patience and prayer. For the medieval mind, rain was not just water. It was judgment. It was mystery. It was the sky deciding whether or not you deserved to live. People did not take it for granted. They listened to the wind. They read omens in bird calls and cloud shapes. A halo around the moon meant change. A still night meant worry. A red morning meant heartbreak. And yet, despite everything, they danced. Because dancing gave rhythm to despair. Because spinning in the mud felt better than standing still in fear. Because movement was a kind of magic, a defiance against silence. When the music failed, they stomped. When their voices cracked, they howled. And when they fell, they stood up and kept moving until the sky remembered them. Eventually rain always came. Maybe not when it was needed. Maybe not enough. But it came. It fell on the graves of those who danced, and on the shoulders of those too tired to raise their arms anymore. It soaked the seeds they'd planted in dry earth long after they'd stopped hoping, and for a while life returned. But never without the memory of what it took, of how desperate they had been, of the dances, the prayers, the punishments, of the children who mimicked frogs and the women who cried into dust. Rain brought life, yes, but also memory. And so the next time the clouds disappeared, the people didn't wait. They danced again, not because it worked, but because it was all they had. Being a local peasant in a medieval village meant you knew the rules of survival. Don't drink downstream from the tannery, boil your barley gruel if the colour looked wrong, and never trust a dry well in midsummer. But if you were a traveller, a merchant from another kingdom, a scholar with a strange accent, or heaven forbid a pilgrim from across the sea, the filth hit harder. Foreigners weren't just guests. They were hazards, curiosities, and sometimes scapegoats. They didn't know which puddles hid rot or which streets turned to sewage when it rained. They asked too many questions. They dressed too cleanly or too strangely. And that was enough. Languages became liabilities. Mispronouncing the name of a saint or town could get you stoned by children or overcharged by the innkeeper. A Flemish traveller might call for water in perfect Latin and receive ale instead, not because no one understood, but because no one wanted him to understand. Suspicion clung to the foreign tongue like fleas on a mule. Locals spoke in thick dialects, and when outsiders failed to follow, it wasn't considered a translation issue, it was taken as disrespect. And if the foreigner fell ill, well, many were quick to assume he'd brought the plague with him. Even religious foreigners weren't safe. A pilgrim bearing the scallop shell of Santiago de Compostela might be welcomed in theory, but in practice he was still a stranger, tracking strange dust through sacred doorways. Some towns imposed fees just for letting foreigners use their wells. Others banned them outright, forcing visitors to rely on surface water that shimmered with the secrets of every hoofprint and chamber pot upstream. If a foreigner got diarrhea, it was his fault for drinking witch water. If he refused the communal bowl of pottage, it was proof he was either rude or cursed. Bathing was already rare in medieval life, but foreigners made it even more complicated. They sometimes arrived with unusual customs like washing their hands before meals or cleaning their teeth with unfamiliar twigs. Locals watched in confusion or horror. Cleanliness could look suspicious. What did they know that we don't? What dirt were they trying to wash away? In some towns, soap was considered foreign sorcery. Lye boiled with herbs and ashes might clean the skin, but it also stung the eyes, and foreigners always brought more of it. Trade routes spread not just spices and silks, but misunderstandings. A Genoese sailor might bring oranges, and suddenly locals believed citrus could cause madness. A Persian scholar carried scrolls, and townsfolk whispered that the parchment was made of cursed skin. Foreign food smelled wrong. Foreign music sounded unholy. Foreign clothes looked like costumes. To travel was to gamble not just with your safety, but with your humanity. One wrong step and you were no longer a guest, you were a walking warning. Foreigners were also blamed for bad weather. If the rains didn't come, it wasn't because of wind patterns or drought, it was because of the dark-skinned man who passed through the village last week, the one who didn't kneel at Mass. When a storm destroyed the barley field, someone remembered the woman with the strange jewellery who asked too many questions about water. People feared what they couldn't control, and nothing was less controllable or more visible than someone who didn't belong. Sometimes foreigners tried to blend in. They learned local phrases, wore coarse wool instead of fine linen, and drank from the same cracked mugs. But they never smelled quite right. The scents of foreign oils or unwashed silks clung to them like guilt. And once a person became the foreigner, no amount of humility could erase it. Children mocked their accents. Dogs barked at their steps. At market they were either ignored or surrounded depending on how exotic their wares were and how bored the villagers felt. The city was worse. In the narrow alleys of medieval towns where wastewater sloshed ankle-deep and beggars coughed blood into gutters, the foreigner was both target and trophy. Pickpockets watched them with glee. Guards inspected them more harshly. If a tavern brawl broke out, the outsider was always blamed no matter who threw the first mug. Some cities had special quarters for foreigners not out of hospitality but containment. You could trade here, sleep there, but never linger too long near the well or the shrine. Even noble foreigners struggled. A visiting lord from Aragon might be honoured at a feast, then fall ill the next day from drinking unboiled water, served by a sullen kitchen boy who didn't like his gold-threaded sleeves. Royal guests travelled with food tasters not out of paranoia, but necessity. What passed for drinking water in Paris might kill a diplomat from Rome. Cleanliness wasn't standard, it was cultural. And most cultures weren't interested in learning from each other's hygiene. Plagues made things worse. During outbreaks, towns closed their gates to anyone with an accent or a horse, bearing foreign saddlebags. Entire ships were turned away from ports their crews left to rot offshore. In one coastal town, a group of Flemish merchants was locked inside their inn and burned alive after a child died of fever. No one wanted to investigate the real cause. They just wanted to burn the fear away. And the foreigner was the most flammable thing around. Monasteries were sometimes exceptions, welcoming travellers with water, food and beds. But even monks grew wary during dry spells or disease seasons. A monk might offer wine instead of water not out of charity, but because he didn't trust the spring outside his walls. Foreigners learned quickly never question the liquid, never ask for a second cup, and always bless the bread before eating. Suspicion, after all, was mutual. Locals feared contamination. Foreigners feared poisoning, and yet they kept coming. Merchants with wool and wax, priests with relics and rumours, scholars seeking old texts, pilgrims chasing saints. Despite the stink, the sickness, the suspicion, they came, because staying still was no safer, because somewhere else the water might be clearer, the bread might be softer, the stairs might be shorter. Travel was a risk, but so was standing still in a dying town where even the rats had left. Some foreigners carried home stories of horrors of water so brown it bubbled of bread baked with ashes of men who hadn't washed in months and were proud of it. But others returned with affection. They remembered a farmer who shared clean well water, a midwife who taught them how to boil milk without turning it sour, a child who laughed at their accent but held their hand anyway. Medieval life was rarely kind, but occasionally it was human. In the end, being a foreigner meant learning fast or leaving early. You memorised where the dogs barked, which alley had the least sewage, which tavern poured beer into clean cups. You stopped asking for water and drank the ale. You wore wool even in heat. You kept your opinions to yourself and your soap hidden in your pack. And when someone asked where you were from, you smiled and said, "Here, for now." Because to survive as a foreigner in the medieval world wasn't about fitting in, it was about not standing out too much. It was about shrinking just enough to be overlooked, while still finding your way to clean water and warm bread. You might never be trusted, never be fully welcome. But if you were careful, clever and quiet, you just might live long enough to dance in the rain. The medieval mind was not entirely devoid of curiosity. It was simply trapped within the limits of what passed for knowledge in its time. When it came to water, theories flowed faster than actual rivers, and nearly all of them were deeply stubbornly wrong. Medieval science leaned more on the stars and sacred text than on observation or heaven forbid taste. If water sparkled, it might be blessed. If it stank, perhaps it had been cursed. And if someone died after drinking it, it was clearly a punishment from God, not a signal that bacteria was winning another invisible war. Medical practitioners, barber surgeons, monks, or travelling herbalists often described water with poetic vagueness and alarming confidence. It could be hot and dry, or cold and moist depending on where it came from, what time of day it was collected, or even what sign the moon was in when you dipped your bucket. Rainwater was sometimes praised as purest, but only if it hadn't touched rooftops or puddled in carts. Groundwater was considered earthy, possibly useful for treating spleen issues. River water could be quickening if caught near a holy site, but deadening near a mill. No one agreed, and yet everyone had an opinion. The dominant framework for understanding the human body, and by extension what you should or shouldn't drink, was the theory of the four humours blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. This system inherited from ancient Greek medicine, and filtered through medieval Latin commentary, turned water into a balancing act. If your body was too hot, you were told to drink cooling waters from shaded springs. If you were melancholy, perhaps a bit of muddy water was just what your humour needed. Every sip was theoretically a treatment, but more often than not it just introduced a fresh parasite into your gut. Alchemists, those cloaked figures half blamed and half respected, had their own views on water. They believed certain waters could transform metals or prolong life. In their manuscripts, penned with faded ink and smudged with candle soot, there were descriptions of living water, philosophical dew and silver fountains. Some of these were metaphorical. Others involved mixing water with mercury or lead, which was decidedly less poetic when ingested. Alchemists rarely shared their drinks with others, which in retrospect might have been the only wise decision they ever made. Clerics and monks wrote long treatises on the spiritual purity of water, quoting scripture alongside half-remembered Aristotle. Baptismal fonts were treated with reverence not for their cleanliness, but for their symbolism. In some cases, monks debated whether blessed water could be reused, or if holy water went bad over time. There were rules strict and contradictory on how water should be stored, in what containers, under what prayers. But the body, that was another matter. A person might splash himself with sacred drops at church, and then go home to drink from a barrel full of rat skeletons. The most scientific way to test water was arguably to drop a piece of silver or bread into it and wait. If the bread floated, perhaps it was safe. If the silver blackened, maybe not. But these were more rituals than experiments. No one considered boiling as a first step unless they were already brewing beer or dyeing wool. Filtration was known in some form. A cloth might be stretched over a jug, but it was more to catch insects than to purify microbes. And since germs weren't invented yet, there was no incentive to hunt them. Midwives and wise women operating far outside the boundaries of academic learning often knew more than the learned men. They advised using spring water for childbirth, warned against stagnant puddles, and sometimes even insisted on warming water for wound washing. But since their authority came from lived experience rather than university scrolls, their knowledge was dismissed as superstition. Meanwhile, actual university doctors prescribed urine in wine for fever and considered that perfectly rational, as long as the urine came from someone holy. Astrology played a disturbingly large role in hydrology. The moon governed tides, so obviously it must also influence the healthiness of well water. Some believed that collecting dew on certain dates, especially during eclipses or saintly feast days, produced medicinal moisture. Others warned never to drink from a stream when Mars was in ascension, lest your humours be stirred to violence. Calendars marked not just harvests and fasts, but days when water should be avoided entirely. On unlucky days, even rain was seen as spiritually contaminated. Of course, this didn't stop desperate people from licking it off rocks anyway. Books of natural philosophy often contained elaborate diagrams explaining the circulation of water in the body. One chart might show water entering through the mouth, passing the stomach furnace, then being refined by the spleen's cold chamber, before leaking out the lower ducts of melancholy. These weren't jokes, they were believed. The illustrations were beautifully drawn and entirely useless. In fact, the more decorated the manuscript, the more likely its theories would kill you faster than the bad water you were trying to avoid. Cities tried to apply reason by building rudimentary aqueducts, cisterns and fountains. But no amount of architectural elegance could fix a bad water source. A marble fountain pouring from a lion's mouth might still draw from a spring next to a graveyard. Some towns added herbs or wine to their public water supplies, more to cover the taste than to clean anything. In one case, a university town added crushed flowers to the cistern as an experiment. It succeeded in making everything smell like funerals, but cholera still came anyway. Not all hope was lost. Here and there, scraps of proto-science emerged small observations that hinted at better methods. Some monks noticed that boiling made water taste better. Others observed that people who drank upstream got sick less often. But these insights rarely spread beyond the cloister walls. Medieval science prized tradition over testing. It didn't help that those who experimented too much were sometimes burned as heretics. Discovery was dangerous when your microscope looked too much like a crystal ball. For the common folk, there was little use in arguing theory. Water was judged by look, smell, and the number of visible worms. If it didn't kill your neighbour, maybe it was fine. If it made your horse refuse to drink better, move on. People trusted dogs more than doctors. A stream avoided by livestock was considered haunted or cursed, which, while unscientific, was often surprisingly accurate. There were myths that certain villages had water that healed wounds or cured boils. Travellers came from afar to fill jugs only to discover the spring was full of moss and bones. But hope has always been immune to smell. Some even believed in virgin water collected by a child before sunrise, never touched by sunlight or shadow, and stored in glass sealed with wax. It wasn't science. But compared to drinking from a sewer-fed ditch, it was at least an effort. Ultimately, medieval science on water was a blend of desperation, dogma, and decorative Latin. It moved slowly weighed down by robes, rituals, and a refusal to admit ignorance. But hidden among the relics and scrolls were the seeds of future understanding. A monk watching mould grow on bread. A midwife boiling water for a newborn. A peasant noticing that clear water from the hills never made him vomit. These moments didn't make it into textbooks, but they mattered. Because while the official science of the age chased stars and stirred potions, the real lessons were learning through suffering. Every fever was a failed hypothesis. Every child buried after drinking swamp runoff was a data point in a ledger no one could read, and every cup of ale raised in relief was perhaps an unconscious toast to survival in spite of it all. In the end, perhaps the greatest miracle of medieval life wasn't the discovery of new herbs, the construction of mighty castles, or the illumination of holy texts. It was that anyone lived long enough to raise a toast at all. The daily act of drinking was less about pleasure and more about survival, a quiet gamble with every swallow. Water could kill, beer might save, and superstition often passed for science. In this uneasy balance, a cup in hand was never just a cup. It was a shield, a prayer, a risk taken out of necessity. And every time it didn't end in fever or burial, it was cause enough to nod in weary triumph. The peasants who tilted their heads toward cloudy jugs and hoped for the best weren't naive, they were pragmatic. Generations of hardship had trained them not to trust the stream without testing it with livestock first, to boil what they could, and to drink ale when possible. Their knowledge wasn't written in books, but passed through calloused hands and whispered warnings at the hearth. Not from that well, a mother might say, jerking her child's hand back. That one made the baby sick. That kind of wisdom didn't win awards, but it saved lives. In towns, public fountains might bubble with ornate pride, but behind the beauty was a labyrinth of cracked pipes, backflow from privies, and the occasional drowned rat. Yet people filled their jugs anyway. They trusted their senses, or the rumours, or the prayers muttered under breath before drinking. Some spat twice before sipping. Others stirred the cup counterclockwise. Was it magic? Maybe. But mostly it was the human impulse to do something, to push back, however slightly, against the filth pressing in from every gutter and chamber pot. And for the rich, survival came in goblets lined with silver and wine imported from places where rivers were cleaner, or at least someone else's problem. Boiling wasn't common, but servants might fetch from private springs or filter through linen. Nobles drank diluted wine or herbal infusions, rarely trusting plain water, unless it sparkled beside a monastery. But even gilded chalices could not protect them from contamination. Typhoid did not distinguish between crown and cap. Sometimes the only difference was who got a Latin prayer said at their funeral. Yet for all its risk, drinking together was one of the few acts that united medieval people across class and creed. Alehouses buzzed with gossip and stories, tankards clinking in dark corners. Monks poured draughts for pilgrims, and farmers passed flasks during harvest. Each shared drink was an act of trust. I believe you haven't poisoned me. I believe we'll both survive until morning. It wasn't just hydration. It was communion, liquid fellowship in an unforgiving world. Humour helped too. People joked about water that walked on its own or beer that bit back. Gallows humour was a necessity when a toothache could mean death, and a sip from the wrong puddle might summon a 3-day fever. They laughed because crying wasted precious moisture, and in between the bitter mouthfuls they found reasons to endure. The stench was unbearable. The risk was high, but the sun still rose, and the barley still sprouted. By the later medieval period, some improvements emerged, slow, patchy and uneven. Monasteries began to manage cleaner wells. Towns experimented with basic sewage systems. Knowledge trickled like a hesitant spring from one region to another. It was never enough, but it was something. And with each small gain, a new toast could be made to the well that didn't kill us, to the rain that didn't carry rot, to the child who drank and kept laughing. They say the Middle Ages were dirty, and they were, but they were also stubbornly alive. Behind every grim statistic was a person who endured a washerwoman hauling pails with a rag tied over her mouth, a shepherd sipping from cupped hands in the early mist, a boy watching the water for ripples before drinking. They didn't have germ theory or glass labware or chlorine, but they had grit. And sometimes grit is enough to carry a civilization forward one sip at a time. So now, centuries later, when we turn on a tap and trust what flows, we are drinking from the edge of their endurance. When we raise our glasses, we echo their hope, fragile, foolish, but undefeated. To live in spite of everything was their greatest science, their finest art, and perhaps their most sacred tradition. So here's to them,